Imagine standing in a desert at dawn, before a field of pyramids that almost no one in the world has ever seen. Picture them. Dozens upon dozens of them, marching across the dunes on a ridge above the Nile. Steep-sided, narrow, sharp as flames, their sandstone glowing rose and amber as the sun comes up out of the eastern desert. They are smaller than the giants at Giza and far more numerous. More than 200 of them along this stretch of river. And here is the fact that should stop you where you stand. There are more pyramids in this country than in Egypt. Not fewer. More. Twice as many, perhaps more than twice. And yet you have almost certainly never heard the name of the people who built them, or of the kings and queens who sleep beneath them, or of the empire they ruled. An empire that lasted, in one form or another, for 1,000 years. That was rich enough to make the pharaohs of Egypt anxious for 3,000. That produced kings who marched north and took the throne of Egypt itself and ruled it as pharaohs, wearing the double crown and building temples on the Nile, and queens who fought the legions of Augustus Caesar to a standstill in the desert and made Rome sue for peace. This is Sudan. The river is the Nile. The same Nile, 1,000 kilometers upstream from the pyramids, you know. The city whose necropolis this was is called Meroë, and the empire is Kush. Around you, in the dawn light, the desert is doing what it has done for 2,000 years, keeping the place quiet. There is no crowd here. There are no coaches, no queues, no touts. Usually there is no one at all but the wind, the scattered goats, and a lone caretaker with a key. Sand has drifted halfway up the flanks of some of the pyramids. Others stand with their tops missing. Sheared off, we will come to this, by a treasure hunter with dynamite in the 1830s. Their chapels face east toward the sunrise, carved with reliefs of kings and queens making offerings to gods with familiar names. Ammon, Isis, Osiris. And to gods with names you have never heard. Apodemak, the lion god of war, 3-headed and 4-armed. Sebiomeka the guardian. The inscriptions are cut in 2 scripts. Egyptian hieroglyphs, which we can read, and beneath them, another script, elegant and unfamiliar, which we can pronounce but cannot understand. Meroïtic, the writing of Kush, whose sounds are known and whose meaning is lost. Even here, at the very center of their world, in their own tombs, the people of Kush keep their secret. Tonight, we will give them back their story. And it is one of the great untold stories of the ancient world. The story of a black African civilization that was not, as the old histories condescended, a pale copy of Egypt at the edge of the map, but Egypt's rival, its trading partner, its conqueror, its heir, and finally its outlasting cousin. A civilization with its own gods, its own script, its own iron industry, its own queens who ruled in their own right. The fabled Candaces, whose title alone terrified Rome, and its own extraordinary trajectory across 3,000 years, from the first great kingdom of Kerma, whose rulers were buried beneath colossal mud mounds with the wealth of a continent, through the centuries when Egypt conquered Nubia and Nubia conquered Egypt right back, to the golden hour of the 25th dynasty, when the kings of Kush sat on the throne of the pharaohs and ruled the whole Nile Valley from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. Black pharaohs, in the old phrase, restoring the temples, reviving the old ways, and building pyramids again after 1,000 years in which Egypt had built none. And then the long, brilliant, strange afterlife at Meroë, the Iron City, the island of the lion god, whose queens fought Caesar's Rome, whose script no one can read, and whose end is still a genuine mystery. Before we walk into the desert, a quiet word. If these long journeys into the deep past bring you something, some calm, some wonder, some company in the late hours, you might take a moment to leave a like and to follow along with the channel, but only if these journeys are truly yours. It is a small thing, and it helps other travelers in the night find their way to this fire. And if you feel like it, leave a word below to say where you are listening from tonight, your city, and the hour it is where you are. There is a quiet pleasure in knowing that someone far away, under another sky, is standing in the same silent field of pyramids tonight. but there is nothing you must do. The only thing that matters now is the dawn light on the sandstone, and the wind in the dunes, and the story that is about to begin. So stand a last moment among the pyramids of Meroë, as the sun clears the desert and the shadows draw themselves long and blue across the sand. Somewhere beneath your feet, a queen is lying in the dark with her jewelry and her lion god, and she has been waiting a very long time for someone to say her name. But before we can climb to her chapel door, we must go back. A very long way back, 3,000 years and more, and 800 kilometers upriver, to the place where all of it began, to the great bend of the Nile, and the black earth, and the gold, and to a rival kingdom whose name the pharaohs of Egypt learned to fear before the pyramids of Giza were 1,000 years old. Before the story begins, the question this fire always asks: how do we know? And with Kush, the question carries an extra weight, because the answer involves not only the usual problems of broken pots and burned archives, but a problem of prejudice so heavy that it bent the entire modern study of this civilization for a century, and the bending must be described before the story can be told straight. Start with the sources, which come in 3 unequal kinds. First and loudest, Egypt. For 3,000 years, the Egyptians wrote about their southern neighbours constantly, and almost always as enemies, subjects, or trading stock. The wretched Kush of the royal inscriptions, the bound captives painted on the soles of Pharaoh's sandals so that he might symbolically tread on them at every step, the tribute bearers on the tomb walls with their gold rings and leopard skins and giraffes. It is an enormous body of evidence, precise about geography, gold quotas, and campaigns. And it is propaganda from a rival state, and it is the frame through which the modern world first met Nubia. The wretched Kush was, quite literally, the first thing Egyptologists ever learned about the place. Second, Kush's own voice, and here we meet the split that shapes everything. For 1,000 years, the kings of Kush wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and those inscriptions we can read. The great stelae of Piye and Taharqa and their successors, the temple dedications, the royal annals. And they are magnificent, giving us Kushite kings speaking in their own words about their own deeds, sometimes with an eloquence and a moral tone that puts their Egyptian models in the shade. But then, around 200 BC, Kush switched to writing its own language in its own script. Meroitic, a native alphabet of 23 signs, elegant, efficient, and to this day undeciphered. We know the sound of every letter, because the signs derive from Egyptian ones. We can read a Meroitic text aloud with confidence and understand almost nothing of what we are saying. The language beneath is a mystery, related to nothing we can securely name. The leading candidates place it in the Eastern Sudanic family, cousin to the Nubian tongues still spoken along the river. The case is strong but not proven. So the empire's last 5 centuries, its most independent, most creative, most distinctively African centuries, speak to us in a voice we can hear but not understand. Proper names, royal titles, and formulae are known. The substance is silent. It is the exact inverse of the Indus Valley's problem, and just as poignant. And third, outsiders. Greek and Roman writers, curious, credulous, and often shrewd Herodotus with his tales of the long-lived Ethiopians and the Table of the Sun. Strabo, who preserves the Roman war with the one-eyed queen. Pliny, the Christian and Islamic chroniclers of later ages. Now the prejudice and the correction, because they are part of the story. When European scholarship first came upriver in the 19th and early 20th centuries and found, in Sudan, deep in Black Africa, pyramids, temples, hieroglyphs, and the trappings of a great state, it very largely refused the obvious conclusion. The finds were explained away by a theory now dead but then dominant, that the Nubians must have been ruled by a lighter-skinned intrusive elite, that whatever was impressive was Egyptian, and whatever was African was primitive, that the black pharaohs of the 25th dynasty were a barbarian interlude. The great American archaeologist George Reisner, who excavated the royal cemeteries and whose fieldwork was superb, published exactly this interpretation of his own finds, and the field followed him for decades. The evidence gathered patiently ever since. The excavations at Kerma revealing an African urban civilization already flourishing centuries before Egypt ever came south. The Meroitic material culture that owes Egypt nothing. The reappraisal of the Kushite pharaohs as restorers and rulers of genuine ambition and skill. The recognition that Kush was borrowing from Egypt the way Rome borrowed from Greece, selectively and on its own terms, has demolished all of it. What replaced it is a civilization that is genuinely and thoroughly African, rooted in the Sudanese Nile, in cattle culture and desert trade, and the sacred kingship of the upper river, which took what it wanted from its great northern neighbor. Gods, script, pyramids, and made those things serve a state whose center of gravity always lay to the south. Hold that correction as we go. It is the difference between seeing Kush as Egypt's shadow and seeing it, correctly, as one of the great civilizations of Africa and one of the longest-lived states in the history of the world. And its story begins where all Nile stories begin, with the river and with what the river carries. The story of how Kush was recovered is worth its own hour, because the excavation history is unusually dramatic and unusually revealing about how knowledge gets made and unmade. The first Europeans came as travellers and looters. The Scottish explorer James Bruce, hunting the source of the Blue Nile in the 1770s, passed the pyramids of Meroë and correctly guessed what they were. The Frenchman Frédéric Caillaux reached them in 1821 and drew them beautifully while they were still intact. His engravings are precious precisely because they show the pyramids with their tops on before Fellini. And in 1834 came Fellini himself with his labourers and his crowbars and the great vandalism. The Prussian expedition of Karl Richard Lepsius arrived in 1844, and it was a different order of enterprise. Methodical, superbly documented, drawing and recording across Nubia on a scale that still serves scholarship. Lepsius's massive volumes preserve inscriptions and reliefs that have since been damaged or drowned, and Egyptology's debt to them is enormous. Then came the era of the great excavators, and with it the era of the great misinterpretation. From 1913, the American George Reisner, a superb field archaeologist, one of the finest of his generation, excavated the royal cemeteries of El Kourou, Nuri, Meroë, and the temples at Gebel Barkal, and established the chronology of the Kushite kings that we still substantially use. His fieldwork was rigorous, his recording exemplary, and his interpretive framework was disfigured by the racial assumptions of his time. Confronted with the evidence of a great African civilization, Reisner concluded that its rulers must have been of a lighter-skinned foreign origin, Libyan or Egyptian, because, he reasoned, the local black population could not have produced it. And his authority stamped that conclusion into the field for decades. It is a chastening case study, and this fire tells it plainly. The same man could dig with impeccable technique and read what he found through a lens that made him wrong about the single most important thing. Data does not interpret itself. The frame does that, and frames come from the world outside the trench. The correction came slowly, then quickly. Excavation at Kerma, begun by Reisner himself, but transformed from the 1970s onward by the long Swiss mission of Charles Bonnet, revealed the deep, indigenous, pre-Egyptian urban civilization that made nonsense of any theory of imported greatness. And Bonnet's team, in 2003, made one of the great finds in African archaeology. Buried in a pit at Kerma, 7 monumental black granite statues of the Kushite pharaohs, Taharqa among them, deliberately broken and hidden, presumably by the Kushites themselves to protect them from Egyptian iconoclasm after the fall of the 25th dynasty. The faces that came out of that pit, magnificent and unmistakably African, are among the most powerful royal portraits to survive from any ancient civilization, and they now stand in the museum at Kerma in the country that made them. The Sudanese Antiquities Service, the Nubian salvage campaigns racing the dams, British, French, Polish, Italian, German, and American missions, and, increasingly and rightly, Sudanese archaeologists directing work on their own heritage. The field today is vigorous, international, and the crucial change, no longer telling the story through a borrowed frame. And here is the thrilling part, which every archaeologist working in Sudan will tell you within 5 minutes of meeting. The work has barely started. The overwhelming majority of Kushite sites are unexcavated. Meroë's residential city is largely untouched. Napata's palaces are barely sampled. Hundreds of pyramids have never been opened. Whole towns show as mounds on the satellite imagery that no spade has ever entered. In Egypt, the great questions are refinements. In Sudan, the great questions are wide open, and the next season could answer any of them. The bilingual that cracks Meroitic, the archive that names the Queen's wars, the tomb that has not been robbed. Of all the civilizations this fire has visited, Kush is the one whose story is most likely to be substantially rewritten within our lifetimes, and rewritten, at last, in the words of the people who lived it. Lay out the country, because Nubia's geography explains almost everything about Nubia's history. Follow the Nile south from Egypt, past Aswan, where the granite comes down to the water and the river breaks into rapids. The first cataract, Egypt's traditional southern door. And you enter a different Nile altogether, where Egypt's river runs broad and lazy through a wide green floodplain. The Nubian Nile fights its way north through a landscape of black volcanic rock and yellow sand, tumbling over cataract after cataract. 6 of them in all, counted downstream from the south, each a barrier of rapids and islands where boats must be hauled, dragged, or abandoned. Between the cataracts, the river swings in enormous curves. The Great Bend, where for hundreds of kilometers the Nile actually flows southwest, away from the Mediterranean, before turning north again. And its floodplain narrows to a green thread, sometimes a few hundred meters wide, sometimes nothing at all, bare rock meeting bare water. The desert presses in from both sides. To the west, the Sahara, to the east, the Nubian desert, and the mountains that fall away to the Red Sea. And the rain, in the north, never comes at all. This is a hard country, and it made hard, resourceful, mobile people. Farmers on the narrow strip, herders of great cattle on the savanna to the south, boatmen who knew every rock in every cataract, and above all, traders and archers, for the 2 great facts of Nubian life are these. The first fact, Nubia is the corridor. Everything Africa had that Egypt wanted came up this river or the desert tracks beside it. And the list is the reason Egypt could never leave Nubia alone. Ivory from the elephant country, ebony, incense and aromatic gums, leopard skins, ostrich feathers and eggs, cattle by the tens of thousands, exotic animals for the temples and palaces, baboons, monkeys, giraffes, once a live panther, and human beings, for Nubian captives and mercenaries, filled Egyptian armies and Egyptian households across 3 millennia. Above all, gold. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, and the Wadi al-Laki in particular, held some of the richest gold deposits of the ancient world, and Nubia sat on top of them. The very name Nubia may derive, some argue, from the Egyptian word for gold, nub, though the etymology is disputed and the association is not. For 2,000 years, Nubia was where the ancient Mediterranean's gold came from, and whoever held Nubia was rich beyond argument. Egypt's obsession with the south, the campaigns, the forts, the viceroys, the tribute lists, is at bottom an obsession with a supply chain. The second fact, Nubia is hard to conquer and easy to defend. Cataracts stop fleets, deserts stop armies. The narrow valley makes every advance a march in single file past archers on the cliffs. And the Nubians were archers, the greatest of the ancient world, by universal agreement of their neighbours. The Egyptians called the land Tarseti, the land of the bow, from their earliest records, and hired Nubian bowmen into their own armies from the Old Kingdom onward, prizing them the way later empires prized Cretan slingers or Genoese crossbowmen. Nubian archery gear. The great composite bows, the leather wrist guards, the arrow-heavy graves, turns up from the deepest prehistory to the Roman wars, and the Greek and Roman writers still marvelled at it 2,500 years later. Put the 2 facts together and you have the engine of 3,000 years of history, a land too rich to ignore and too tough to hold, sitting astride the only road between Africa and the Mediterranean world. A permanent, unavoidable, mutually obsessive relationship between two civilizations who spent 3 millennia trading with each other, marrying each other, imitating each other, invading each other, and occasionally ruling each other, and who, in the end, were far more alike and far more entangled than either would have admitted. The Egyptians wrote the first draft of that story and wrote themselves as the heroes. Tonight we read the other draft. The first great power of the Nubian Nile rose at the head of the third cataract, on a fertile basin where the river slows and the land opens out. A place called Kerma, and until a century ago, no one suspected it had existed at all. What the excavators found there, and are still finding, is one of the most important discoveries in African archaeology. An indigenous urban civilization, unmistakably African, that flourished from around 2500 BC to 1500 BC. 1,000 years. And that was, for much of that time, Egypt's equal and its rival, not its dependent. At its height, Kerma was a true city, perhaps the first city in Africa outside Egypt. Streets, workshops, granaries, palaces, a defensive wall and ditch, a population in the many thousands, and at its heart, dominating the plain then as now, the extraordinary structure the local Arabic calls the defufa, a colossal solid mass of mud brick, 50 meters long, 25 wide, and 18 high. A temple mountain of brick, the largest ancient structure in Africa outside Egypt, still standing 4,000 years later like a great eroded cliff in the middle of the fields, with the ruins of its stairways and sanctuary on top, where the god of Kerma once received his offerings above the roofs of the city. And a few kilometers east, in the desert, lies the necropolis, and here the Kerma kings speak. Tens of thousands of burials cover the ground, and among them, growing across the centuries, the royal tumuli, enormous circular mounds of black and white pebbles, the greatest of them 90 meters across, the largest burial mounds in Africa. Beneath them, in chambers of mud brick, the kings of Kush lay on funerary beds of ebony and ivory, under gold-leafed sandals, surrounded by the wealth of a continent, gold jewelry by the kilogram, faience, ivory inlays of astonishing artistry, the famous Kerma inlays of lions and hippopotami and winged giraffes, bronze daggers, the finest pottery ever made in the Nile Valley, and that judgment is not sentimentality. Kerma's polished red and black beakers, walls thin as an eggshell, with their metallic silver-grey band at the lip, are technically and aesthetically among the great ceramics of the ancient world, unmatched by anything Egypt ever fired, and every Egyptologist who handles one concedes it. And around the royal chamber, the darker page, lay the sacrificed. Retainers, servants, and wives, in some of the great tumuli by the hundreds, in one case perhaps as many as 400, laid out to accompany the king into the next world. The practice of retainer sacrifice is attested in the earliest phases of Egypt too, and in the royal graves of and it is one of the grim signatures of the first sacred kingships everywhere. The king who takes his household with him because he is not thought to be entirely a man. Around the tumuli stand ranks of bucrania, the horned skulls of sacrificed cattle, laid out in great crescents in the sand. In one royal mound, more than 4,000 of them, the herds of an entire country slaughtered for a funeral. And in those cattle skulls, and in the mound itself, the archaeology speaks plainly about what Kerma was. Not a provincial imitation of Egypt, but a native African kingdom in the deepest sense. A cattle culture, a mound building, retainer burying, sacred kingship state of the Upper Nile, rich on the gold and ivory road, trading with Egypt as an equal and, in the end, meeting it as an enemy. For when Egypt fell into the chaos of its second intermediate period, the age of the Hyksos, when foreign kings held the delta, the king of Kush did not cower. He allied with the Hyksos against Egypt. His armies raided north as far as the great Egyptian temples of the south, carrying home statues of Egyptian nobles as loot they were found in the Kerma tombs, which is how we know. And an intercepted letter, quoted in an Egyptian inscription, shows the northern Hyksos king writing to the ruler of Kush to coordinate a two-front war against Thebes. Egypt caught, at the lowest moment of its history, between two enemies, one of them African, both of them expecting to divide the corpse. It did not happen. Egypt rallied under the princes of Thebes, expelled the Hyksos, and turned south with the fury of a state that had just learned it could die. And what followed was the annihilation of the Kingdom of Kerma and 500 years of Egyptian occupation, the deepest and most consequential colonization in ancient African history. Some places are so charged that empires organize themselves around them, and Gebel Barkal is one. It deserves its own hour, because for 1,000 years it was the single most important place in Africa outside Egypt, and because standing at its foot explains more about Kush than any document. Picture it. The Nile, having run north for 1,000 kilometers, swings west in its great bend, and on the right bank, in a plain of sand and scrub, there rises abruptly, without foothills, without warning, a flat-topped mountain of red sandstone, 100 meters high, its sides sheer, its summit level, standing entirely alone. And at its southwestern corner, a great column of rock has weathered free of the cliff and stands out from it, a pinnacle, 75 meters tall, narrow, upright, and when the light is right, and the Egyptians who came here in 1450 BC thought the light was very right indeed, unmistakably shaped like a rearing cobra, the uraeus, the royal serpent that every pharaoh wore on his brow. To an Egyptian priest, this was not a coincidence. It was a revelation. Here was a mountain wearing the crown. And on its face, they found, or believed they found, the outline of a white crown of Upper Egypt in the rock. The conclusion was obvious to them and became doctrine. This mountain was the birthplace of Amun, his southern home, the Thebes of the south, the source of the god's power and of pharaonic kingship itself. And the Egyptians of the new kingdom cut temples into its foot, and the Kushites after them expanded those temples into one of the great sacred complexes of the ancient world. A huge temple of Amun with a hall of columns, a processional avenue of rams, chapels cut into the living rock of the pinnacle itself, and, later, pyramids scattered on the plain around it. Now feel what that meant for a Nubian king. The god who legitimized every pharaoh in Egypt lived by Egypt's own theology in your country, on your mountain. His oracle spoke there, and it spoke to you. Piye's victory stele was raised at the mountain's foot. Taharqa cut a temple into the pinnacle and gilded its summit. The Kushite kings came here to be crowned, brought before Amun's sanctuary so the god could nod them onto the throne. And when a Kushite king marched north into Egypt, he did not go as a foreign conqueror in his own mind. He went as the man Amun of the Pure Mountain had chosen, coming to restore the god's neglected houses in the north. Egypt built the argument. Kush used it. The colonizer's own most sacred claim became the colonized's instrument of conquest, and the instrument was a mountain. It is still there. The pinnacle still rears against the sky. The temple ruins still lie at its foot. A Kushite pyramid field stands beside it in the sand, and a rock-cut chamber high on the cliff, its walls once covered in gold leaf, still catches the morning. UNESCO lists it, and archaeologists work there, and almost no tourists come. Climb the mountain at dawn. It is an easy scramble on the backside, and you can see the whole geography of this story laid out beneath you. The Nile shining, the green thread of the fields, the desert running away to the horizon in every direction, the ruins of Napata in the palm groves, the pyramids of Nuri across the river where Taharqa sleeps under the water table. 4,000 years of history visible from one rock. And behind you, catching the first sun, the stone cobra that started it all. A coincidence of erosion that two civilizations agreed to read as the handwriting of God, and that decided, in consequence, who would rule the Nile. Around 1500 BC, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, Thutmose I and his successors, the greatest conquerors Egypt ever produced, came south with the full weight of a militarized state, and this time they did not raid, they stayed. Kerma was stormed, and its great city burned. The royal tumuli were plundered. The kingdom that had faced Egypt as an equal for 1,000 years was extinguished, and the whole Nile as far as the Fourth Cataract and beyond, nearly 1,000 kilometers of river, was annexed outright. What followed was 5 centuries of colonial administration of a thoroughness the ancient world rarely matched: a viceroy. The king's son of Kush, an office of enormous power, one of the great offices of the Egyptian state, held by men who were often not royal at all but trusted administrators, governed the province from a new capital in the south. Garrison towns and massive mud-brick fortresses studded the river, some of them built centuries earlier and now expanded, with names that tell you exactly what they were for: repelling the bowmen, curbing the foreign lands. Gold mining was industrialized in the eastern desert, with wells dug and roads cut, and quotas that appear, year by year, in Egyptian ledgers. The quantities are staggering. Tons of gold across the new kingdom, the wealth that gilded Tutankhamun's coffin and paid for the temples of Karnak. And the local population was governed through Egyptianized Nubian elites. The sons of Nubian chiefs taken north, raised at Pharaoh's court, taught Egyptian, given Egyptian names and Egyptian gods, and sent home to rule their father's people as loyal officials, a colonial technique so effective that later empires reinvented it independently, again and again, down to the 19th century. But the deepest instrument was not the fortress or the mine, it was the temple. Egypt planted its gods in Nubia on a scale it applied nowhere else. Above all, one god, Amun, the great hidden god of Thebes, king of the Egyptian pantheon at the empire's height, whose priesthood was the richest institution in the ancient world, and Egypt chose, for Amun's southern home, a specific and extraordinary place: Gebel Barkal, the pure mountain. A lone, sheer-sided sandstone butte rising 100 meters out of the plain by the Nile at Napata, near the Fourth Cataract, with a natural pinnacle at one corner that the Egyptians, gazing at it, saw as a colossal rearing cobra. The uraeus, the royal serpent of the pharaonic crown, standing eternally on the mountain. That was enough. The priests declared Gebel Barkal the southern residence of Amun himself, his second Thebes. Thutmose III and his successors built a great temple at its foot, and Rameses II enlarged it, and for the rest of antiquity, the pure mountain was one of the holiest places in the world, holy to Egypt, and in time, far more consequentially, holy to Kush. Read that sentence again, because in it lies the twist of our entire story. Egypt, to hold Nubia, taught Nubia to worship an Egyptian god at a Nubian mountain, and thereby handed the Nubians, 400 years later, the one thing they would need to conquer Egypt: a claim. Not a claim of arms, of legitimacy. If Amun dwells on this mountain in our country, if Amun chooses kings, if the kings in Egypt have become impious and neglect him, then Amun may choose a king here. And when Egypt's empire finally collapsed, around 1070 BC, and the viceroys and garrisons and tax collectors went home for good, they left behind, in the deep south, a Nubian world that had spent 5 centuries absorbing Egypt's language, Egypt's gods, Egypt's script, Egypt's ideology of divine kingship, and had lost none of its own gold, its own archers, or its own ambitions. The colonizer withdrew and left the tools of empire lying in the hands of the colonized. It took them 300 years, and then they used them. 500 years is a long time to be somebody else's province, and the fire owes an honest hour to what the Egyptian occupation of Nubia actually felt like on the ground. Because it is one of the best documented colonial systems in the ancient world, and because everything Kush later became was forged inside it. The physical instrument was the fortress. Even before the New Kingdom conquest, Egypt's Middle Kingdom pharaohs had ringed the Second Cataract with a chain of the most sophisticated military architecture of the Bronze Age: Buhen, Semna, Magisa, Uranati, and their sisters. Enormous mud-brick castles with bastions, ditches, glacis, covered stairways to the river, arrow slits engineered for enfilading fire, and granaries and barracks inside, a system of signal posts and patrol tracks between them, and this is the detail that reveals the mind behind it, a documented practice of patrolling and reporting. The Semna dispatches, a papyrus copy of a fort commander's reports, records the movements of Nubian groups crossing the frontier with the dry precision of a border control log 4,000 years ago. These forts were built to control trade and movement, not just to repel armies. They were customs posts with battlements. Most of them now lie under Lake Nasser. Above the forts sat the administration, the king's son of Kush, the viceroy, with his deputies, his scribes, his gold quota officers, and his garrison commanders. A full colonial bureaucracy governing a territory 1,000 kilometers long. And beneath it, the population, Nubians, taxed, conscripted, mined, and, the deepest instrument of all, educated. The sons of Nubian chiefs were taken to Egypt, raised at court, taught to read and write Egyptian, given Egyptian names and Egyptian gods, and returned home as loyal officials. Egyptian-style temple towns rose along the river. Nubian elites built Egyptian-style tombs, worshipped Egyptian gods, and wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphs. Historians call it acculturation, and it worked so thoroughly that by the end of the New Kingdom, distinguishing an Egyptianized Nubian noble from an Egyptian settler in the archaeological record is genuinely difficult. And yet, and here is the point of the whole hour, it did not take. Underneath the Egyptian veneer, the Nubian substrate survived intact. The mother's line, the brother's succession, the cattle, the bow, the tumulus grave, the local gods. When Egypt's empire collapsed and the viceroy sailed home, the Nubian elites did not simply revert, nor did they remain Egyptian. They did the far more interesting thing that colonized peoples with a strong culture of their own have done again and again in history. They kept the tools and discarded the master. Egyptian writing, kept, and used to record Kushite deeds. Egyptian gods, kept, and made Kushite. Ammon moved to the mountain and started choosing Nubian kings. Egyptian royal ideology, kept, and turned around. The divine kingship Egypt had used to legitimize its rule over Nubia became, in Kushite hands, the legitimation of Nubian rule over Egypt. Egyptian pyramids, kept, and rebuilt in a new steep style, on a scale Egypt itself had abandoned. It is one of the great case studies in the history of empire, and its moral is not comfortable for empires. Everything you teach a subject people in order to govern them becomes, in the fullness of time, their inheritance and your rival's toolkit. The colonizer's greatest gift to Kush was not the wheel or the temple. It was a full working education in how to be a superpower. And Kush, having sat through 5 centuries of the course, graduated and marched north to sit its final exam. The 3 centuries after Egypt's withdrawal are the most obscure in Nubian history. An archaeological twilight in which almost nothing is written and little is dug. And out of that twilight, around 800 BC, there emerges, fully formed and already wealthy, a new Kushite kingdom centered on Napata in the shadow of the Holy Mountain. Where it came from is genuinely uncertain, and honesty requires the fire to say so. The old model imagined a family of local chiefs rising to power in the vacuum, gradually adopting Egyptian trappings. Newer work at the royal cemetery of El Kuru, near Napata, has traced the ancestry back through generations of increasingly grand tumulus burials. Mounds, at first, in the old Kerma manner, evolving step by step into Egyptian-style tombs and finally into pyramids. A family climbing, generation by generation, from African chieftains to Egyptian-style kings, and taking a whole society with them. Where they got their wealth is less mysterious. The gold was still there, the trade roads were still there, and with Egypt fragmented into squabbling principalities. The third intermediate period, when the pharaoh's authority had collapsed into a patchwork of local dynasts and priestly enclaves, the whole southern trade was in Kushite hands. What is remarkable is the ideology they built, and how sincerely they seem to have believed it. The kings of Napata presented themselves not as conquerors of Egypt's traditions, but as their true guardians, legitimate rulers chosen by Ammon of the Pure Mountain, ruling in the ancient way, keeping the rights that the degenerate north had abandoned. Their titles were pharaonic. Their monuments were Egyptian in form. Their burials, from around 750 BC, were pyramids. Steep, small, sharp-angled pyramids, distinctively Kushite in style, but pyramids nonetheless. Raised, note the date, at a moment when Egypt itself had not built a royal pyramid for 800 years. The Kushites were not copying contemporary Egypt. They were reviving an archaic, sacred, half-forgotten Egypt, the Egypt of the Great Age, as a statement of who the real heirs were. Their god was Amun, but Amun of Napata, a distinctly Kushite Amun, ram-headed, whose oracle at the mountain chose kings and whose priesthood in Kush wielded a political power that Egypt's own Amun priests would have envied. Their succession was Kushite too, and here the African substrate shows through the Egyptian veneer with unmistakable clarity. The throne passed not from father to son in the Egyptian manner, but, characteristically, among brothers, and legitimacy ran through the mother. A matrilineal principle whose deepest expression was the office that would astonish the Greeks and Romans. The king's mother, the queen mother, a figure of enormous formal power in Kush, and the reason that Kushite queens would eventually rule in their own names. This is what the fire meant, at the outset, about borrowing on one's own terms. From Egypt, the gods, the script, the pyramids, the pharaonic style. Underneath, and never surrendered, the Nubian bones. The mother's line, the brother's succession, the cattle, the archers, the gold, and the mountain. By 750 BC, this kingdom had absorbed the whole of Nubia. And then it looked north, at an Egypt in chaos, at temples in disrepair, at petty kings squabbling over the delta. And the king of Kush, a man named Piye, who was by every indication one of the most extraordinary rulers of the ancient world, decided that Amun had had enough. Between the fall of the 25th dynasty and the flowering of Meroë, there falls an episode that the fire cannot resist, because it is the first entry in what became a very long ledger, the list of world-conquering empires that marched on Kush and came home with nothing. In 525 BC, Cambyses II, great king of Persia, conquered Egypt. And Persia at that moment was the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. Egypt fell in a season. And Cambyses, according to Herodotus, writing 70 years later from Egyptian informants who had their own reasons to enjoy the story, then turned his attention south to the fabulously rich kingdom of the long-lived Ethiopians beyond the cataracts. He sent spies first, disguised as an embassy bearing gifts, and the Kushite king, seeing through the deception at once, sent them home with a gift of his own and a message that Herodotus clearly relished recording. An unstrung Kushite bow, with the advice that when the Persians could draw a bow of that size as easily as he did, they might come with an army. And even then, they should thank the gods that the Ethiopians had never thought of invading Persia. It is almost certainly a folk tale. It is also a perfect distillation of what everyone in the ancient world believed about Kushite archery, which is why it was told at all. Cambyses came anyway, and the desert answered. Herodotus's account is a catalogue of catastrophe. The army marched south with insufficient supplies. The food ran out before a fifth of the way. The soldiers ate their pack animals, then the grass, then. The passage that has appalled readers for 2,500 years drew lots and ate each other, and Cambyses, at last, turned back, having lost a large part of the greatest army on earth to sand, thirst, and distance without a battle. And a second Persian force, the same historian adds, sent west toward the oasis of Siwa, walked into a sandstorm and was never seen again. The famous lost army of Cambyses, still hunted by archaeologists and still unfound. Modern historians treat the numbers with proper skepticism and note that Persia did establish some kind of frontier presence in Lower Nubia. Kushite tribute bearers appear on the reliefs at Persepolis, which suggests at least a nominal submission of the border zone. But the core fact stands and is not seriously disputed. The Persian Empire did not conquer Kush. It made the attempt, it suffered badly, and it stopped. And with that, the pattern of 4,000 years was set, and set publicly, before the eyes of the ancient world. Egypt at its absolute zenith could take Nubia, and did at enormous cost, and held it only with a 5-century military occupation. Assyria, having conquered Egypt itself, never once attempted to follow the Kushites south past the cataracts. Ashurbanipal, master of the world from the Nile to the Zagros, sacked Thebes and stopped there. Persia tried and ate its pack animals. Alexander, who went to India, never went to Meroë. Rome would try and would sign, and the Caliphate would try and would sign. Kush's greatest weapon, in the end, was not the bow or the elephant or the gold. It was the arithmetic. The simple, unanswerable calculation that every empire eventually performed and every empire eventually failed, which asked how many soldiers and how much water it would cost to take a country of cataracts and deserts held by the best archers alive, and what exactly you would have when you got there, and whether it would not be simpler, all things considered, to trade with them instead. We know what happened next in extraordinary detail, and we know it because Piye himself told us, on one of the greatest historical documents to survive from the ancient world, the Victory Stele, a great slab of grey granite, inscribed on all four sides with more than 150 lines of superb Egyptian hieroglyphic prose, which Piye set up in the Temple of Amun at the foot of the Pure Mountain around 727 BC, and which archaeologists lifted out of the sand at Gebel Barkal in 1862. It is the fullest campaign narrative from anywhere in the ancient Nile world, and it is, as we shall see, one of the strangest documents of conquest ever written, because its hero keeps stopping the war to be shocked at people's behaviour toward horses. The situation, as the stele opens, Egypt has fragmented, and in the delta, a strong prince of the western delta named Tefnacht has begun uniting the north by force, city by city, and is pushing south. Into Middle Egypt, toward Thebes, toward the sphere that Kush regards as its own, and, more to the point, toward the temples of Amun. Piye's officers in the south send word, and the king's reaction, as the stele records it, is not eagerness, but a kind of weary, majestic irritation. He sends orders to his forces already in Egypt, and the orders are the most remarkable thing in the whole document. The rules of engagement of an army marching to conquer a country. Do not attack by night in the manner of a game. Fight when you can be seen. Challenge him to battle from afar. If he says wait for the infantry and cavalry of another town, then you shall sit still until his army comes. Fight when he says the word. And if his allies are in another town, let them be waited for. Do not boast of strength. Do not be proud of the sword. Harness the best horses of your stable. Form the line of battle. But know that Amun is the god who sends us. And then, before the fighting, when you arrive at Thebes, at the temple of Karnak, enter the water, purify yourselves in the river, dress in fine linen, unstring the bow, lay down the arrow. Boast not to the Lord of might, for the strong has no might without him. He makes the weak-armed into the strong-armed. Only then, purified and humble before the god, may they fight. And they must let the enemy assemble first, and offer battle openly, and give warning. Whatever we make of it. And the fire will hold both readings. This is, undeniably, a piece of royal self-presentation, a king casting himself as the pious restorer against impious usurpers. And it is also, undeniably, unlike any other conquest text in the ancient Near East, where kings boast of surprise, slaughter, and pillage as a matter of course. Piye's stele is a war narrative whose organizing value is piety, and whose hero fights, by his own account, reluctantly and by the rules. The campaign itself is told with the pace of a good novel. The Kushite army moves north. The sieges begin. City after city yields. Hermopolis holds out longest under its prince, Nimlot, and here comes the scene that has made Piye immortal. When Hermopolis at last surrenders, Nimlot sends out his wife to plead with the king's women. The treasures are brought out. Gold, precious stones, horses, the finest of everything. And Piye is unmoved. He enters the palace, inspects it, goes to the treasury and the storerooms. And then he goes to the stables. And there he finds the horses of Hermopolis starving, thin, neglected, weakened by the long siege. And the king of Kush, master now of Egypt, turns on the defeated prince in a fury the stele records without embarrassment. As I live, as Ra loves me, that my horses were made to hunger pains me more than any other crime you committed against me. He takes the horses into his own care, confiscates the stables, and adds the prince's crime to his account. It is the single most famous passage in Kushite literature, and it tells us two true things: that Piye was a horseman of the horse-loving Kushite aristocracy. The royal tombs at El Kuru, uniquely in the ancient world, contain the burials of the king's chariot teams, whole horses interred, standing in harness with silver trappings, and the Kushites bred the finest horses of the age, exporting them even to Assyria. And that here was a man whose moral universe was genuinely his own, and did not run on the grooves of Egyptian or Assyrian royal cliché. By the campaign's end, all Egypt had submitted. The great princes of the Delta came to Piye's camp and prostrated themselves. Tefnakht himself, cornered in the marshes, sent word of surrender and swore his oath by messenger. And Piye, in a final gesture that says everything, accepted it and did not pursue him. Then the king of Kush went to Thebes, made his offerings to Amun, installed his sister as the god's wife of Amun, the great priestly office that gave Kush religious sovereignty over southern Egypt. And, having conquered the whole Nile from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa and become the first black African pharaoh of a united Egypt in 1,000 years, he went home. Straight home, up the river, to Napata, to his mountain, his temple, and his horses, and he never set foot in Egypt again. He ruled the north through vassals and his own family for the rest of his life. And when he died, he was buried, not in the Valley of the Kings, but in a small, steep pyramid at El Kuru, in a chamber cut into the rock, with his chariot horses standing in their own graves nearby. He is one of the ancient world's great enigmas, the conqueror who did not want the throne he had won, only the god's approval and the safety of his horses. The dynasty he founded, the 25th of Egypt, was about to give the Nile Valley one of its most remarkable centuries. Piye's conquest had a second front, and it was fought without a single arrow, by women, in temples, with property deeds and adoption papers, and it was arguably more durable than anything his army achieved. To hold Egypt, Kush needed Thebes, and Thebes, by the 8th century BC, was not really ruled by a king at all, but by the vast, ancient, immensely rich estate of the god Amun, and at the head of that estate stood one of the most extraordinary offices in the ancient world, the god's wife of Amun. She was a celibate priestess princess, the god's earthly consort, who controlled the temple's enormous wealth and lands, performed the rituals a king would otherwise perform, wrote her name in a royal cartouche, and, since she could have no children, passed her office by adopting a successor, a self-perpetuating female dynasty of divine wives, effectively the rulers of Upper Egypt. Piye grasped what this meant instantly. Rather than garrison Thebes, he had the reigning god's wife adopt his own sister, Amanirenas, as her heir and successor. And that was that. Within a generation, the office was Kushite, and it stayed Kushite. Amanirenas I, then her Kushite successors, ruling the sacred heartland of Egypt for the house of Napata without a single Kushite soldier stationed there, the conquest completed by adoption. Look at Amanirenas today in the museum at Cairo. Her alabaster statue is one of the loveliest pieces of the whole 25th dynasty, a serene young woman in a close-fitting sheath, hand-raised, cartouche on her arm, and her mortuary chapel still stands at Medinet Habu among the temples of the great pharaohs. She and her successors administered vast estates, commissioned buildings across Thebes, and governed the south while their brothers fought in the Delta or ruled from Napata. And behind them stood a figure even more distinctively Kushite, the king's mother. Egypt honored its queen mothers, Kush institutionalized them. The Kushite succession, as we saw, ran through the mother's line. A king's legitimacy came in significant part from who his mother was, and the royal women of Napata and later Meroë accordingly held formal, public, and often decisive power. They appear on the stelae, they participate in the great ceremonies, they are named in the inscriptions with titles of their own, they are buried in pyramids beside the kings. It is the deep African substrate showing through the Egyptian costume, and it did not fade with the dynasty's fall. On the contrary, once Kush was back in the south and free of Egyptian convention, the principle grew until it produced, 5 centuries later, the ruling queens who would fight Rome. The Greeks and Romans, puzzling over these women, would reach for the nearest word and call them all Candace. But the institution they were fumbling toward began here, in the 8th century BC, when a conqueror who could have installed a garrison installed his sister instead, and discovered that in the ancient world, a woman with a temple's account books could hold a city more securely than a regiment. The century of Kushite rule over Egypt, roughly 747 to 656 BC, the 25th dynasty, was, by the sober judgment of modern Egyptology, one of the great restorations in Egyptian history. And the irony is exquisite, because it was performed by the people Egypt's own propaganda had spent 2,000 years calling wretched. Piye's successors took the throne of a country that had been fragmenting for 3 centuries and set about, with visible conviction, putting it back together in the old form. Shabaka, Piye's brother, moved the royal residence north and ruled Egypt in person from Memphis, the first Kushite pharaoh to actually govern from the ancient capital, and his reign set the tone of the whole dynasty. Archaism as policy. Temples were restored the length of the river. The ancient rites were revived. The sculptors were sent back to study the statuary of the Old Kingdom, 1,000 years dead, and taught to carve in its manner. And the resulting Kushite style is one of the most striking in Egyptian art. The archaic dignity of the old models, but with unmistakably Nubian faces, broad and strong and individual, wearing the double uraeus. 2 royal cobras on the brow instead of 1, the 25th dynasty's own emblem, proclaiming the 2 lands of Egypt and Kush in a single crown, and the skull cap and ram's head amulets of Amun in the Kushite fashion, and the muscular, unidealized bodies of a warrior aristocracy. And the scribes were set to a project that stands as the dynasty's intellectual monument. Shabaka, finding in a temple archive a worm-eaten papyrus containing an ancient and revered theological text. The Memphite creation theology, in which the god Ptah creates the world by conceiving it in his heart and speaking it with his tongue, ordered it copied onto a great slab of black granite so that it should survive forever. It did survive, and it sits in the British Museum today, the Shabaka stone, one of the profoundest documents of Egyptian religion. Creation by thought and word, an idea whose resonance later readers have found startling. Rescued from decay by an African king who thought Egypt's oldest wisdom was worth immortalizing in stone. History added a cruel footnote. The stone was later used, in some medieval century, as a millstone, and the grooves cut across the text destroyed much of it. But what survives because a Kushite pharaoh cared, and Kush built. After 8 centuries in which Egypt had raised no royal pyramids, the 25th dynasty built them again, at El Kuru and Nuri, near the Holy Mountain. Not the vast, gentle slopes of Giza, but the steep, sharp, tall-shouldered Kushite pyramid, 40 to 50 degrees, small-footed and soaring, with a chapel on the east face. The form that would be repeated for the next 1,000 years, and that would eventually cover the deserts of Sudan with more pyramids than Egypt ever built. Temples rose the length of the Nile, and above all at home. Gebel Barkal was rebuilt into a sacred complex of the first rank, and new temples went up across Nubia. The god who had been imported as an instrument of colonization was now the patron of an empire that had turned the tables. And at Thebes, the dynasty's religious authority was cemented by the office of the god's wife of Amun, held by Kushite princesses in unbroken succession. A female line of divine consorts controlling immense temple wealth who adopted their successors and thereby held the south for Kush without a single garrison. The Nile Valley, from the delta to the Fourth Cataract, some 3,000 kilometers of river, was one state ruled by Nubian kings, and by any measure, it was the largest empire in Africa and one of the largest states on earth. But an empire that stretches to the shores of the Mediterranean acquires the Mediterranean's enemies. Kush's pharaohs, holding Egypt, inherited Egypt's foreign policy. And Egypt's foreign policy, in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, meant one thing: containing the terrifying new power that was swallowing the Levant, province by province, and whose armies now stood on the borders of Sinai. Kush's kings did what Egypt had always done. They backed the small kingdoms of the Levant: Israel, Judah, the Philistine cities, Phoenicia. with money, encouragement, and troops, hoping to keep the war far from the Nile. It was rational. It was also, in the end, fatal. Because the power on the other side of that policy was the Assyrian Empire, whose story this fire has already told, and which does not forgive interference. The collision, when it came, would be fought by the greatest of all the Kushite pharaohs, whose name is in the Bible, on Assyrian palace walls, and on temples from the delta to the depths of Africa. A man whose reign was the summit of Kushite power and the beginning of its retreat, Taharqa. Stand in a museum gallery before a statue of a Kushite pharaoh, and you will know it in a second, even if the label is turned away. Because the 25th dynasty produced one of the most immediately recognizable artistic styles of the ancient world, and understanding how it was made is understanding the dynasty itself. Begin with what they borrowed. The Kushite kings deliberately reached back over the whole of Egypt's recent past, over the Ramesside age, over the Middle Kingdom, to the art of the Old Kingdom, 1,000 years and more before their time. The taut, broad-shouldered, four-square royal statuary of the Pyramid Age, with its severe frontality and its stripped-down monumentality. They sent their sculptors to study it. They had old works copied, and the resulting archaism is one of the most self-conscious revivals in the history of art. A whole aesthetic program declaring that the Kushites were restoring Egypt to its true and ancient self, and that the intervening centuries of decline were an aberration to be edited out. It worked so well that Egyptologists have occasionally mistaken 25th dynasty pieces for Old Kingdom ones at first glance. The sincerest possible compliment to the copyists. And then look at what they added, because it is unmistakable and it is entirely their own. The faces are Nubian, broad, strong, with high cheekbones, full lips, and a hard directness of gaze. And they are individualized in a way Egyptian royal portraiture had largely abandoned. These are recognizable men, and their sculptors clearly wanted them recognized. The bodies are muscular and heavy, not the slender idealization of Egyptian convention, but the physique of a warrior aristocracy that hunted and rode. The heads wear the Kushite cap crown, close-fitting, with a diadem and streamers. And on the brow, the emblem that announces the dynasty to anyone who can read a crown, the double uraeus. 2 rearing cobras instead of the pharaoh's traditional one, proclaiming the 2 kingdoms of Egypt and Kush united in one man. At the throat hang the ram's head amulets of Amun on cords, the specifically Nubian Amun in his specifically Nubian form. And the whole is often carved in the hardest and darkest stone available. Black granite and granodiorite, polished to a depth that swallows the light. An aesthetic choice that modern viewers, standing before Taharqa's colossal black head in Khartoum, find almost unbearably powerful. Put the 2 halves together. Archaic Egyptian form, Nubian face and emblem. And the statues are a political argument you can hold in your hand. We are the true heirs of the oldest and best Egypt, and we are Kushites, and both of those things are true at once, and we see no contradiction whatever. That is the 25th dynasty in a sentence, and it is why their art is so arresting. It is confident in a way that neither imitation nor mere conquest can produce. The 7 great statues buried at Kerma, smashed and hidden by the Kushites themselves after Egypt turned against their memory, dug out of their pit in 2003 and standing today in the museum at Kerma, magnificent, reassembled, and home, are the finest surviving expression of it. Look at Taharqa's face there. It is the face of a man who ruled the Nile from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa, restored the temples of a civilization older than his own, fought the greatest empire on earth to a standstill for a decade, and lost. And it does not, in any particular, look defeated. Taharqa came to the throne around 690 BC. A young man who had already, as a prince, marched north with the army into Palestine, and reigned for 26 years. And the first half of that reign was the golden age of the entire Kushite achievement. The Nile ran high, year after year. Taharqa recorded the wonderful floods of his 6th year in a series of stelae, boasting, as a Nile king could, of an inundation so generous that the harvests broke records and the rats and worms drowned in the fields. And on the wealth of those harvests and the gold of Nubia, he built as no pharaoh had built in 500 years. At Karnak, the greatest temple complex on earth. His colossal kiosk still stands in the first court, one gigantic column of it upright to this day, and his works are scattered through the precinct. Temples and shrines went up the length of the river, and in Nubia, at Kawa, at Sanam, at Gebel Barkal, he raised the finest buildings of the Kushite age. The temple at Kawa, whose reliefs and inscriptions survive, and the great rock-cut temple at the foot of the holy mountain, and colossal statues of himself in the strong Nubian style, black granite giants that stand today in Khartoum and in museums abroad, unmistakable and magnificent. Taharqa's Egypt was rich, orderly, pious, and immense. And Taharqa himself, in the surviving portraits, has the most memorable face of all the Kushite kings. Broad, powerful, watchful, the double uraeus on his brow. He is also, and this is not a small thing, one of the very few African kings whose personal name entered the scriptures of half the world. He appears in the Bible as Taharqa, king of Ethiopia, marching north against Sennacherib's army. Precisely the moment of the great Assyrian campaign of 701 BC that we followed from the other side at this fire. Whether the young Taharqa's army actually forced the Assyrians away from Jerusalem, or whether the relief came from plague, tribute, or accident, the biblical writers remembered the Kushite king as a deliverer, and the memory travelled with the scriptures around the world. Then the storm broke. Assyria under Esarhaddon, the anxious conqueror whose reign we have already walked, decided that Egypt's meddling in the Levant would end at the source. In 674 BC, his first invasion failed, thrown back at the frontier, and Taharqa's prestige soared. But Assyria's method was to come again. In 671, Esarhaddon crossed the Sinai with camels carrying water, smashed the Egyptian army in 3 battles, and took Memphis in half a day. Taharqa fled south, but his queen, his harem, and his crown prince Ushanahuru were captured and marched to Nineveh in chains. The scene carved on Esarhaddon's victory stele at Zinsirli, where a small kneeling figure with distinctly Nubian features and a rope through his lip is led by the great king, the Kushite prince, a trophy in stone, still visible in Berlin today. Taharqa did not surrender. He waited, retook Memphis the moment the Assyrians left, and drove out their governors. Esarhaddon marched back to punish him, and died on the road in 669, which the Kushites must have read as Amun's verdict. But Ashurbanipal came in his father's place, and Ashurbanipal was implacable. He reconquered Egypt, drove Taharqa south, and installed client princes in the delta. Egyptian collaborators who would, in the fullness of time, become the 26th dynasty and the instrument of Kush's expulsion. Taharqa died in 664 BC, back in Nubia, having lost the northern half of his world, and he was buried in a splendid pyramid at Nuri, in the shadow of the holy mountain, with a rock-cut tomb below it that flooded, over the centuries, with groundwater, so that the greatest of the Kushite pharaohs sleeps today in a chamber that archaeologists must dive into in scuba gear, working underwater by torchlight in the tomb of the man who once ruled the Nile from the delta to the heart of Africa. The end came under his successor Tanutamani, and it came at Thebes. The new king marched north in 664, retook Memphis, killed the Assyrian client pharaoh, and briefly held Egypt again. And then Ashurbanipal's army came back, and this time it did not stop at Memphis. It marched on Thebes, the 1,000-year holy city of southern Egypt, the greatest religious centre on earth, which no foreign army had ever taken, and sacked it. The temples stripped, the treasuries emptied, 2 great obelisks hauled away to Nineveh. A catastrophe so absolute that the ancient world spoke of it for generations. The Hebrew prophet Nahum, writing decades later, could still find no stronger image for the fall of a great city than, "Are you better than Thebes?" It was 663 BC, and it was the end of the Kushite Empire in Egypt. Tanutamani withdrew to Nubia. The 25th dynasty was over. The Black Pharaohs had ruled Egypt for less than a century. But they had restored its temples, revived its arts, saved its oldest theology from the worms, and reminded it what a pharaoh was supposed to be. They went home to the south, back beyond the cataracts, and closed the door behind them. And it was there, in the deep desert, out of the reach of the Mediterranean's armies. that Kush would live for another 1,000 years and become something entirely, gloriously its own. Before we follow Kush south for good, pause on the strangest feature of this entire 3,000-year relationship. Two civilizations locked in a mutual obsession, each convinced of its own superiority, each borrowing constantly from the other, and each, in the end, unable to explain itself without the other. Egypt's official view never budged in 3 millennia. Nubia was wretched Kush. The phrase is formulaic, appearing century after century in the royal inscriptions with the mechanical regularity of a legal boilerplate. Nubians appear on temple walls as bound captives, on painted footstools and sandal soles so that Pharaoh might tread on them, in tribute scenes bowing under the weight of gold rings and ostrich plumes. And yet, Egyptian armies were full of Nubian archers, whose skill Egyptian officers praised without irony. Egyptian households were full of Nubian servants and Nubian wives. Egyptian temples were staffed with Nubian priests. A Nubian could rise to be a high official of the Egyptian state, and did. And the Egyptian elite's own bodies, in the south especially, were as African as their neighbours. The border between Egypt and Nubia was a political line, not a human one, and the people on either side of it were kin and knew it. The propaganda said one thing, the payroll said another. Every empire in history has spoken this way about the people it depends on. And Kush's view of Egypt? Here the mirror is more interesting, because Kush never once, so far as the record shows, wrote off Egypt as barbaric or inferior. It did the opposite. It revered Egypt, the Egypt of the Great Age, as the source of true religion, true kingship, true art, and it justified its own conquest of Egypt precisely on those grounds. Piye's stele does not sneer at the Egyptians. It sneers at particular Egyptian princes for being impious, for neglecting Amun, for fighting among themselves, for behaving in a manner unworthy of the tradition they had inherited. The Kushite pharaoh's whole program, the archaizing art, the restored temples, the revived Old Kingdom sculpture, the ancient theology copied onto granite, was an argument, in stone, that Kush understood what Egypt had forgotten. It is one of the most remarkable postures a conquering power has ever adopted. Not we are better than you, but we are more faithful to you than you are. Rome would take a similar line about Greece, centuries later. But Rome did not have 3,000 years of being called wretched to answer for. And the deepest irony is what happened to the two civilizations afterward. Egypt, having called Nubia wretched for 3 millennia, fell to Assyria, to Persia, to Greece, to Rome, and did not rise again as an independent power for 2,000 years. The pharaonic tradition it had guarded for so long ended not in Egypt but in the south, at Meroë and at Philae, in Kushite hands. The last royal pyramids in the world were Nubian. The last hieroglyphic inscription in the world was carved at the request of Nubian worshippers in AD 394, when Egypt itself had been Christianized and its temples were closing. The people who were painted on the footstools kept the faith the longest. Whatever else can be said about the long quarrel of the two Niles, the last word. Literally, the last written word of a 3,000-year-old script belonged to Kush. The retreat from Egypt could have been the end of the story. Instead, it was the beginning of the strangest and most original chapter of it, because Kush, forced back on itself, discovered what it actually was. The court remained at Napata for a time, under the holy mountain, and the kings went on being buried in pyramids at Nuri for 3 centuries. But the center of gravity was shifting, steadily and irreversibly, southward, to a city on the east bank of the Nile between the 5th and 6th cataracts, in a broad region the Greeks would call the island of Meroë, because it is enclosed by the Nile, the Atbara, and the Blue Nile like a great island in the sand. Meroë. And around 300 BC the shift became formal, when the kings stopped being buried at Napata and began building their pyramids in the desert above Meroë instead. Historians used to explain the move as flight, pointing to a Ptolemaic Egyptian raid that sacked Napata in 23 BC and to Persian and Egyptian threats before it. The modern reading is richer, and it looks south rather than north. Meroë was simply a better place to be for a kingdom that had stopped looking at the Mediterranean. It stood at the meeting of the desert caravan roads and the river. It commanded the routes east to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean trade, and south and west into the African interior. It lay in the rain belt. This is the crucial thing, where the summer monsoon reaches, so that Meroë had grasslands and seasonal rains and could support cattle and sorghum and millet without depending wholly on the Nile flood. And it sat amid iron ore and, above all, amid the acacia woodlands that provided the charcoal to smelt it. Kush had turned its back on Egypt and faced Africa. Everything that follows flows from that turn. And what followed was a flowering, the Meroitic period. Roughly 300 BC to AD 350, 6.5 centuries, is Kush at its most independent and most distinctive, and it is the era that finally silences any lingering notion of a provincial copy of Egypt. The Egyptian gods remained. Ammon above all, and Isis, whose great temple at Philae, on the Egyptian border, remained a shared holy place where Kushites worshipped for centuries. But they now shared the temples with gods that were purely Kushite, and one of them dominates, Apedemak, the lion god. A warrior deity of Nubia with no Egyptian equivalent whatever, portrayed as a man with a lion's head, or as a lion, or, in one astonishing relief at the Temple of Naka, as a magnificent three-headed, four-armed lion god, an image so unexpected in a Nile context that scholars have wondered aloud about influences from India, a suggestion neither proven nor absurd, given the trade routes we shall come to. Apedemak's temples at Musawarat es-Sufra at Naka are unmistakably African monuments. Lion god flanked by kings, elephants marching around the walls, a whole visual world with its own logic. And the language went its own way at last. Around the 2nd century BC, Kush stopped writing in Egyptian hieroglyphs and began writing its own language in its own alphabet. Meroitic script, 23 signs in 2 forms, hieroglyphic for monuments and cursive for everything else, with a word divider, a small triple dot that no Egyptian scribe ever used. It is one of the earliest indigenous writing systems of sub-Saharan Africa, and, as we said at the fire's start, it remains undeciphered. The sounds known, the meaning hidden, so that the most self-expressive centuries of Kushite civilization speak to us in a voice we cannot understand. And the third pillar of Meroitic distinctiveness was industrial, iron. The great stories of Kush are royal, because the royal stories are the ones carved in stone. But the fire has one more hour to give to the household, the unit in which 4,000 years of Nubian life was actually lived, and the evidence, gathered from village cemeteries, house plans, and the patient work of bioarchaeology, lets us see it more clearly than one might expect. The Nubian house, from Kerma to Meroë to the villages photographed before the flooding, is a courtyard house, rooms of mud brick around an open square, flat-roofed, whitewashed or ochre, the courtyard, the true living space. Cooking, sleeping in the hot months, the grindstone, the beer jars, the animals at night. Around it, the compound, the granary, the byre, the goat pen. Extended families lived together. The archaeology of village cemeteries shows kin buried in clusters across generations. Women ground the grain. The skeletal signature of hours at the quern, the same in every ancient society. Brewed the sorghum beer. Wove? Made the pottery in the village tradition. The fine painted wares came from workshops, but the household pots were women's work, as they were across Africa, managed the household economy. Men herded, farmed, mined, hunted, and fought. Boys learned the bow from the age they could hold one. And the herds, always the herds, were the family's wealth, its bride price, its insurance, and its pride, exactly as they are in the cattle cultures of the Upper Nile today, 4,000 years later. 2 things about this world are worth marking. The first is the status of women, which, while we should not romanticize a hierarchical ancient society, was demonstrably higher than in most of the contemporary world. The royal women's power at Meroë did not spring from nowhere. It grew out of a social order in which descent, property, and identity ran significantly through the mother's line, and in which women's graves in ordinary cemeteries are as well provisioned as men's, and sometimes better. The second is the deep continuity of childhood. the toys turn up in the Nubian graves. Clay animals, little figures, gaming pieces, balls. The children were buried with them, and with their beads, and often with a small pot of something to eat. And through the whole 4,000 years, the household kept the things the state could not. When Kerma burned, the households survived. When Egypt occupied, the households paid taxes and went on grinding sorghum. When the 25th dynasty fell, when Meroë emptied, when the Christian kingdoms rose and fell, when Arabic came and Nubian retreated, the courtyard, the quern, the herd, the bow, the beer, the beads, and the children with their clay animals carried on, generation to generation, along the same riverbank. That is why there are Nubians today. That is why the language survived to be a cousin of Meroitic. And that is why this whole story, which began with an empire and a conquest, ends. As this fire's stories so often end, with the discovery that the empire was the loud part and the household was the durable one. Approach Meroë across the desert today, and you will see, before the pyramids, something stranger, great black mounds, some of them enormous, ringing the ruins of the ancient city. Hills of slag, the waste of centuries of smelting, so vast that early travellers assumed them natural, and modern archaeologists have used them to estimate the scale of the industry. Meroë was an iron city, one of the great ironworking centres of the ancient world and, by common consent, the most important in Africa north of the equator. And the old grand phrase for it, coined by an excavator in the 1910s, has stuck: the Birmingham of Africa. The phrase overstates and oversimplifies. Kush was never an industrial economy, and iron was never its principal export. But the underlying fact stands. For centuries, Meroë's furnaces turned out iron on a scale that supplied its own armies and workshops and traded outward, and its metalworkers' skill is visible in everything from weapons to the fine tools in the tombs. The industry ate charcoal, and the charcoal ate the acacia woodlands, and one of the working theories about Meroë's eventual decline, we will weigh it in its place, is that the furnaces helped consume the very forests the city needed to survive. But iron was only one thread in a commerce that made Meroë one of the great crossroads of the ancient world. Look at the map as a Meroitic merchant saw it. North, down the river and the desert roads, went the classic African luxuries to Egypt, now Ptolemaic, and then Roman. Ivory above all, and ebony, and gold, and incense, and exotic animals, and, in quantities the sources make painfully clear, enslaved people, a trade that ran the length of this river for millennia in every direction and that no honest telling can omit, and war elephants. The Ptolemies, needing elephants to match the Indian beasts of their Seleucid rivals, came south to get African ones, and Meroë supplied and trained them. The great enclosure at Musawarat Sufra, with its ramps and courtyards and its walls carved with elephants, is thought by many to be an elephant training centre, and if so, it is the only one known from the ancient world. East, across the desert to the Red Sea ports, ran the road to the wider ocean, and it was a real road. Meroitic goods reach the coast, and coastal goods reach Meroë, and here the finds become astonishing. In the royal tombs and city ruins of Meroë, archaeologists have found Roman glass and bronze, Hellenistic silver, Greek wine amphorae, and objects from India, beads, and, most famously, a small bronze figure of the Indian god Harpocrates-style child deity of the Alexandrian type alongside Indian-made items. Meroë sat at the western terminus of the Indian Ocean trade network, and the goods of Barigaza and Alexandria met in its markets. And south and west, into the African interior, went the roads we know least about, and that mattered most to Meroë itself, to the savannas of Kordofan and Darfur, to the highlands, to the sources of ivory and gold and cattle. A Roman geographer could describe Meroë, a Roman merchant could buy Meroitic ivory in Alexandria, and none of them, so far as we know, ever grasped that the city they were dealing with was the gatekeeper of a continent. And Meroë itself, at its height, was a proper metropolis of the ancient world. The excavations reveal it, a royal city walled in stone, with palaces, a great temple of Amun with a processional avenue of rams, Baths are curious, elaborate water building with statuary that has puzzled excavators for a century, workshops, and residential quarters spreading beyond the walls. And around it, in the countryside, an agricultural system engineered for the rain and river country. Hafurs. Great circular reservoirs, hundreds of meters across, dug to catch and store the seasonal rains for cattle and crops through the dry months, ringed with statues of lions and frogs, whose remains dot the landscape for kilometers, and which represent, in their way, the same civic genius we admired in another river valley on another night, the state investing its surplus in water for everybody. Sorghum and millet in the fields. African crops, not Egyptian ones. Cattle in enormous herds. The deep Nubian wealth, still central after 3,000 years. Iron in the furnaces. Ivory and gold on the roads. And, ruling all of it from a palace on the Nile, a monarchy unlike any other in the ancient world. Because at Meroë, more than anywhere else in antiquity, the ruler was as likely to be a woman. A kingdom that survived 4,000 years on the world's most coveted trade road did not do it by charm. Kush's military history is one of the least told and most impressive in the ancient world, and it rests on 3 pillars, each of them distinctively its own. The bow, first and always. The Egyptians named the country Land of the Bow before they named it anything else, and the reason is visible in every Nubian cemetery from the Stone Age to the Middle Ages. The archery equipment. The long, single-stave bows of the early periods, the composite bows later, the leather wrist guards, the arrows tipped with flint, ebony, bone, and eventually iron, sometimes poisoned. The skeletal signatures of a lifetime's draw on the bones of the men themselves. Nubian archers served in Egyptian armies from the Old Kingdom onward, prized like no other troops. A famous model army from an Egyptian tomb of about 2000 BC shows a platoon of 40 Nubian bowmen marching in step, and the modeler gave each man an individual face. Kushite archery was a national institution, trained from boyhood, embedded in the culture. And it stayed lethal for 4,000 years. It broke Egyptian raids, checked Roman columns, and, in the 7th century AD, blinded the armies of the Caliphate at Dongola. When the Arab chroniclers called the Nubians the pupil smiters, they were paying an unwilling compliment to a tradition that predated the pyramids of Giza. The horse, second, and here Kush's reputation is startling. The Kushites were among the ancient world's great horse breeders. The Napatan kings rode and drove. Piye's fury at the starving stables of Hermopolis was the reaction of a connoisseur, and the royal tombs at El Kuru contain the world's only known cemetery of royal chariot teams. Horses buried standing, in harness, with silver-plated trappings and bead nets, 4 to a grave, so that their kings might drive in the next world as they had in this one. And Kushite horses were an export of the first rank, Assyrian royal correspondence. The very files we read on another night at this fire records Kushite horses arriving in Nineveh as prized purchases, the finest chariot horses available on the international market. The empire that terrorized the ancient world bought its best teams from the kingdom of the Black Pharaohs, and the elephant, third. Kush's strangest military asset. Africa's own elephants roamed the savannas south of Meroë, and the Ptolemies of Egypt, desperate for war elephants to face the Indian beasts of the Seleucids, came south to get them. The great walled enclosure at Musawarat es-Sufra, with its ramps, courtyards, and elephant-carved walls, is widely thought to have been a training centre, and if so, it is unique in the ancient world. Kushite armies used elephants themselves. A relief at Musawarat shows one carrying captives. The reliefs of Apedemak's temples are thick with them. And the trade in trained African elephants was a Meroitic specialty, sold to Egypt for its wars in Asia. Put the 3 together, and the picture is of a military system perfectly adapted to its geography and its ambitions. Unmatched missile infantry, an aristocratic cavalry and chariot arm on horses everyone wanted to buy, elephants for shock and for export, and the decisive multiplier, a homeland of cataracts, deserts, and heat that no invading army could cross without paying a price that made the whole exercise unprofitable. Persia tried and lost an army in the sand. Rome tried, won the battles, and signed a treaty giving everything away. The caliphate tried and settled for 6 centuries of peace. The Kingdom of the Bow was, on the evidence, one of the hardest targets in the history of warfare. The Greeks and Romans, hearing of the kingdom beyond Egypt, came away with one fact above all others, and it fascinated them: the Ethiopians. Their word for the peoples of the Upper Nile were ruled by queens, and the queen's title, they reported, was Candace. It was a misunderstanding of a beautiful kind. Candace. The Meroitic word was not a personal name, but an office. The Queen Mother, the great royal woman of Kush, whose formal power reached back to the matrilineal roots we noted at Napata, and who, in the Meroitic centuries, ceased to be merely the mother of the king and became, repeatedly, the sovereign herself. A ruling queen in her own right, with her own royal titles, her own campaigns, her own pyramids, and her own colossal reliefs on the temple walls. The classical world, meeting one, assumed the title was a name. The mistake travelled far. Into the New Testament, where the Acts of the Apostles reports the conversion of an official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, a court eunuch and treasurer reading Isaiah in his chariot on the road from Jerusalem, a Kushite official from Meroë, appearing in the founding narrative of Christianity as one of its earliest converts, and carrying the faith, the tradition holds, back up the Nile. The reliefs let us see them, and they are like nothing else in ancient art. At Naka, on the wall of the Lion Temple, Queen Amanirenas stands beside her co-ruler King Natakamani, both of them raising the sword over the enemies of Kush in the ancient pharaonic pose of triumph. And the queen is depicted at the same scale as the king, performing the same act, wielding the same weapon, not a consort at his elbow, but a monarch in her own right, striking her own enemies. And her body is rendered. This is the deliberate, unmistakable, entirely Kushite aesthetic. As ample, powerful, and majestic, in a style utterly indifferent to the slender Egyptian ideal, the queens of Meroë are shown as physically imposing rulers, and the art wants you to feel their weight. The pyramids of Meroë hold them. The inscriptions name a whole succession. Amanirenas, Amanishaketo, Amanitor, Amanihatashan, and more. Some ruling with sons, some ruling alone, across the most powerful centuries of the kingdom. Amanishaketo's pyramid gave up one of the richest hoards of jewellery ever found in Africa. Heavy gold armlets and signet rings, shield rings with the ram's head of Amun, necklaces of astonishing craftsmanship, and thereby gave the story one of its bitterest modern chapters, which waits for us a little further on, and one of them, at the very moment when Rome had swallowed the entire Mediterranean world and stood, apparently invincible, on the southern border of Egypt, fought the empire of Augustus Caesar, and got the better of it. We have watched the queens fight. Watch now how they ruled, because Meroë's political system, reconstructed from the reliefs, the titles, and the excavated palaces, is one of the more unusual constitutions of the ancient world, and the picture that emerges is not the Oriental despotism the Greeks imagined, but something considerably more interesting. At the top, the monarchy. And it was, distinctively, often a dual monarchy. The reliefs at Naka show King Natakamani and Queen Amanirenas together, at equal scale, performing the same royal acts, each with a full royal titulary. Other reigns pair a queen with her son as co-ruler. Kingship was sacred. The monarch was Amun's chosen, and the coronation involved the god's oracle. But it was not, so far as we can tell, hereditary in the simple father-to-son way. The succession moved among the royal kin, with the mother's line decisive, and the choice made or ratified by the great council and the god. That council is the second pillar, and it is the surprise, the sources. Greek accounts, and the Kushite stelae themselves, which record the selection of kings, describe an assembly of the great, the commanders of the army, the chiefs of the great families, and above all the priests, gathering to deliberate and to present candidates to the god. Whatever its practical power in any given reign, its formal existence tells you that the Kushite king was not simply an absolute autocrat in the Egyptian mold. He was chosen, and everyone knew he was chosen. And the memory of what a priesthood that chose kings might also do to them is preserved in that dark story of the priests of Ammon sending death orders to kings until Ergamenes marched in with his soldiers. Below the throne, an administration whose Meroitic titles we can read phonetically and understand only in part. A chancellor or chief of the household, officials of the treasury and the granaries, governors of the provinces, of whom the most important was the viceroy of the north, ruling Lower Nubia from Pharaohs as a semi-autonomous prince, priests of Amun and of Apedemak in the great temples, controlling estates and herds, and, throughout, the royal women who held offices, owned property, and left their own inscriptions. Justice, taxation, corvée labour for the Hafirs and the temples, the maintenance of the caravan roads and the customs posts, the marshalling of the army and the elephants, the machinery of a functioning ancient state, and the honest caveat, a machinery whose details are mostly hidden behind the unread script, so that we know its skeleton from the stone and almost nothing of its flesh. And on the walls, one visual convention says more about this state than any missing document. Wherever a Meroitic king appears in the great scenes, smiting enemies, offering to Apedemak, receiving the crown, a queen very often appears beside him, doing the same thing, at the same size, with the same weapon in her hand. In 3,000 years of Egyptian art, there is nothing remotely like it. Hatshepsut had to be depicted as a man. Nefertiti's parody is one exceptional reign and controversial ever since. In Meroë, it is normal enough to be boring to the artists, who repeat it from temple to temple without apparent excitement. A civilization tells you its assumptions in what it takes for granted. And the assumption Meroë took for granted and carved into the walls of its holiest buildings for 600 years is that a woman could be the sovereign of Kush and that nobody needed it explained. The confrontation came in 25 BC. Rome had annexed Egypt 5 years earlier. Antony and Cleopatra were dead, and the young Augustus, master of the world, had made the Nile his personal property. The Roman frontier now stood at the First Cataract, and beyond it lay Kush. The Romans imposed taxes on the buffer zone, garrisons manned the border towns, and the prefect of Egypt marched off to Arabia with the bulk of the army. The Kushites, under their ruling queen, Amanirenas, and her son, the crown prince, struck. It was a serious, professional invasion. The Kushite army crossed the frontier in force, overran the Roman garrison towns of Syene, Elephantine, and Philae, defeated the cohorts stationed there, took prisoners, and enslaved captives. And, in the act that made the campaign immortal, they smashed the bronze statues of Augustus Caesar that Rome had planted on the frontier as tokens of its majesty, and carried the pieces home as trophies. Rome's response was inevitable and ferocious. The new prefect, Gaius Petronius, came south with legions, threw the Kushites back, stormed the frontier towns, marched on the Kushite second city of Napata itself, the holy city under the pure mountain, and sacked it. The great temples of Ammon burned, the treasures taken, the population enslaved. It was a brutal demonstration of what Rome did to states that touched it. And then something happened that Rome was not accustomed to. The Kushites did not collapse. They did not sue for terms and pay tribute. They fought on. A war of raids, sieges, and attrition in a country where the desert killed legions and the cataracts stopped fleets. The sources record the Kushites besieging the Roman garrison at Primis and Petronius marching to relieve it, and the queen sending envoys, and the fighting resuming, and the war grinding on for years without a Roman victory that could end it. The Greek geographer Strabo, our main source, describes the Kushite queen he calls Candace as a masculine sort of woman, blind in one eye. And there she is, a one-eyed warrior queen leading an African kingdom in a 5-year war against the empire of Augustus. Amanirenas' army could not beat Rome. Rome could not beat Amanirenas. And in about 21 or 20 BC, the war ended in the way that tells you exactly who had won. Kushite envoys were sent, not to the prefect, but all the way to Augustus himself, who was then on the island of Samos, and the emperor granted them, in Strabo's flat and astonishing phrase, everything they asked for. The the Treaty of Samos. Rome withdrew from the buffer zone it had occupied, abandoned its southern outposts, and, the point that mattered most, remitted the tribute entirely. Kush would pay Rome nothing. The frontier was fixed at the old line. The two states became, in effect, friendly neighbours. And for the next 300 years, Rome and Kush kept a peace so stable that trade flowed freely. Roman goods filled Meroitic tombs, and Roman citizens travelled up the river as tourists. Augustus, who taxed the world, took no tribute from the Kingdom of Kush, and the Queen kept one more trophy. When British archaeologists excavated at Meroë in 1910, they dug beneath the steps of a temple, the shrine of a building now called the Temple of Victory, and found, buried under the threshold, a magnificent bronze head, larger than life, its glass and stone eyes still staring. The severed head of a statue of Augustus Caesar, hacked from one of the frontier statues smashed in the raid of 25 BC, carried 800 kilometers south and deliberately interred beneath a doorstep, so that every Kushite entering that temple, for centuries, would tread on the head of the first Roman emperor. It is one of the most eloquent objects in the British Museum, where it now sits, a masterpiece of Roman portraiture, its lifelike eyes gazing out with the god emperor's serene confidence, dug out of Sudanese sand, where an African queen had put it to be walked on. History rarely writes an ending so precise. Rome ruled from Britain to the Euphrates and called it the world, and a one-eyed queen on the upper Nile fought it to a standstill, won her peace, kept her gold, paid nothing, and buried Caesar's face under her feet. Gather now, as a kind of chorus, the voices of everyone else, because Kush was described by more foreign civilizations than almost any other African state, and the descriptions, laid side by side, are a portrait in themselves. The Egyptians, as we have seen, said wretched, and traded, hired, married, and eventually knelt. The Assyrians, who fought Taharqa for a generation, recorded Kush with grudging precision in their annals as the great power behind Egypt, and bought its horses. The little kneeling prince on Esarhaddon's victory stele is Assyria's parting shot at a rival it never actually reached. The Hebrew scriptures are unexpectedly warm. Kush appears in the Bible constantly, as a land of great wealth and might, as the far edge of the known world, as a place from which help might come. The prophet Isaiah addresses the land of whirring wings beyond the rivers of Kush. Taharqa marches in as a would-be deliverer against Sennacherib, and in the New Testament, as we saw, the treasurer of the Candaces becomes one of the first converts to the new faith, reading scripture in his chariot on a desert road. An African official from Meroë, present at the very birth of Christianity. The Greeks were fascinated and generous. Homer, at the dawn of the tradition, has the gods themselves going off to feast with the blameless Ethiopians at the ends of the earth. The earliest reference of all, and a compliment. Herodotus reports them as the tallest and most handsome of men in their kingdom, as the source of fabulous gold, and preserves the tale of the unstrung bow and the wreck of Cambyses' army. Diodorus records that they claimed to be the oldest people on earth and the ones who taught Egypt its religion. A claim that says less about history than about the confidence with which the Kushites made it, and which no Greek writer appears to have found absurd. The Romans, having fought them, were respectful in the sober way of people who have signed a treaty. Strabo gives us Amanirenas and the war, and Pliny catalogues the kingdom, and the frontier stayed quiet for 3 centuries. And later, the Arab chroniclers, who had every incentive to disparage a Christian state that had beaten them, instead recorded the archers who shot at the eyes and the treaty that held, and Nubia enters Islamic geography as a formidable and respected neighbour. Set the chorus together, and you hear something remarkable. Every civilization that actually met the Kushites, as opposed to writing about them from a distance for domestic consumption, came away impressed with their archery, their horses, their gold, their queens, their stubbornness, their antiquity. The condescension in the record is almost entirely Egyptian court boilerplate, and it is the one strand that modern Europe chose from the whole chorus to amplify. Everyone else who was actually there, from Homer to the Caliph's generals, took Kush seriously. It is worth remembering, in the small hours, how often the loudest description of a people turns out to be the least informed one, and how much better the world understood this kingdom 2,000 years ago than it did 100 years ago. The fire has earned a walk through the living city, so let us take one. An ordinary day in Meroë, around AD 50, in the reign of the great co-rulers Natakamani and Amanitor, when the kingdom stood at its zenith, the peace with Rome held, and the caravans came in from 3 directions. Come from the river at dawn, up from the landing where the boats are unloading. The Nile here is broad and slow, fringed with palms and acacia, and the light comes up over the eastern desert exactly as it did when we began our night among the pyramids. The city rises ahead, not the white limestone of Egypt, but warm red-brown sandstone and mud brick, walls the colour of the earth they came from, with the great enclosure of the royal city ahead. A stone wall around palaces, temples, and the audience halls of the queen and king. Enter through the Amun temple's processional way, an avenue lined with stone rams, and the day's first business is already underway. Priests in white linen, the smell of incense from the sanctuary, a queue of petitioners in the forecourt waiting for the temple's officials, who are also, in the Kushite manner, the state's officials. Beyond the sacred quarter, the city gets loud. The market, cattle in from the savanna, lowing in their pens. The wealth of Kush on the hoof, sacks of sorghum and millet, the African grains, dates and dom palm fruit, baskets of cotton, spun and woven here. Meroë wove fine cotton centuries before most of the Mediterranean saw it. Pots. And here pause, because Meroitic pottery is one of the glories of the ancient world. Eggshell-thin painted wares, decorated with vines and lotus, with giraffes and crocodiles, with lively little frogs and ankhs and geometric bands, some of the finest ceramics ever made in Africa, thrown by potters whose names we will never know and whose eyes for line and colour would grace any age. In the metalworkers' quarter, the ring of hammers and the reek of charcoal from the furnaces beyond the walls were the smelters. The men who made Meroë, the Iron City, are working their bloomeries under the black slag mounds. Merchants haggle in 3 or 4 languages, Meroitic in the street, Greek at the higher end of the market, the trade tongue of the Red Sea, Egyptian for the temple business, the tongues of the desert nomads, and the southern savanna at the caravan yards, where an eastbound train is loading ivory and ebony for the Red Sea ports, and a westbound one is coming in with gold dust and ostrich feathers from the interior. And at the centre of it, the monarchy, the palace, with its audience hall, the royal women's establishment, the officials with their Meroitic seals and their cursive scripts on ostraka, the crown prince inspecting the elephant enclosures out at Musawarat, where the great beasts, Africa's own war elephants, trained here as nowhere else on earth, are being worked in their walled courts. Out beyond the city, the countryside is doing what the countryside always does. Farmers at the shadufs and the great water wheels. The sakya, the ox-driven wheel that arrives in these centuries and transforms Nile agriculture forever. Herders bringing cattle to the Hafir, the enormous circular reservoir, its banks guarded by stone lions, its water, caught from last season's rains, still holding through the dry months exactly as the engineers intended. And in the evening, when the heat breaks, the sun goes down behind the western desert and lights the pyramids on the eastern ridge, where the queens and kings of Kush lie under their steep sandstone monuments, each with its little chapel facing the sunrise, each with its reliefs of a monarch offering to Apedemak the lion and Amun the ram, each with its Meroitic inscription that we can sound out and cannot understand. The city goes quiet, the lamps come on, the cattle settle, the last caravan of the day comes in through the southern gate with its bells and its dust. And the great trading crossroads of Africa, rich and self-possessed and utterly its own, sleeps under a sky of stars so thick that the Milky Way lays a road of its own across the desert, from the pyramids on the ridge to the black horizon. It is, at that hour, one of the most successful cities on earth. It has been prosperous for 600 years, and its people, if the ruins around them held any message they could read, might have felt as permanent as we all do on any given evening. Within 300 years, it will be empty. One more journey before the fading. The journey that made the kingdom rich, reconstructed from the goods in the tombs and the roads still visible in the sand. Begin far to the south and west of Meroë, on the savanna, at the end of the dry season, where a caravan is loading for the long haul north. Ivory first. The great tusks, cut in the elephant country and carried on poles between men, or lashed to donkeys. Ebony logs, ostrich feathers and eggs, packed in straw, leopard and cheetah skins, gold dust in leather bags from the workings of the eastern hills, incense gums. Live animals for the northern markets, monkeys, a young cheetah on a chain, and a pair of elephants walking under their own power, destined, if the Ptolemaic agents are buying, for a war in Asia. And the part of the manifest that no honest telling omits. Human beings, taken in the raids and wars of the interior, walking north in the same column, whose sail in Egypt was one of the oldest and grimmest commerce on this river, older than the pyramids and, tragically, not finished with antiquity. The column comes into Meroë through the southern gate, and the city takes its cut. The officials weigh, tally, and tax with Meroitic seals. The goods are broken up and redistributed. The elephants go out to the great training enclosure at Musawarat, the ivory goes to the workshops or onward, and from Meroë the roads fork. One goes north down the Nile, but not all the way. At the Great Bend, the smart money leaves the river and crosses the Bayuda Desert on the Camel Road, a hard shortcut of some 250 kilometers with wells at intervals, saving weeks. Then back to the river at Napata, and north again by boat and portage through the cataracts to Lower Nubia and the Egyptian frontier at Philae, where Roman customs officers are waiting and Roman merchants are buying. The other road goes east, across the desert to the Red Sea coast and the ports of the Ptolemaic and later Roman trade, and there the world opens. In the harbour lie ships that will run before the monsoon to India and come back with pepper, beads, and cotton cloth. The Greek-speaking captains have a handbook of these waters. The merchants of Alexandria have written one, and Meroë is in it, named as the source of the ivory and tortoiseshell coming down to the coast. Somewhere on that quay, a bale of Meroitic ivory is loaded beside a jar of Italian wine, and back up the road toward the city goes a crate of Roman glass, a bronze lamp, a silver cup. The very objects that archaeologists would lift, 2,000 years later, from a queen's pyramid in the sand. Follow the goods to their ends, and the map of Kushite trade turns out to be a map of the whole ancient world. Sudanese ivory becomes a Roman lady's hairpin in Pompeii. Nubian gold gilds a temple in Alexandria. A Meroitic elephant, trained in a walled enclosure in the Sudanese desert, dies in a battle line in Syria. And an Indian bead, carried by a monsoon ship to an African port and then inland by camel, ends up in the grave of a woman on the upper Nile who never heard the name of India. That is what it meant to sit at the crossroads. Everything passed through, and something of everything stayed. And when, in the 3rd century AD, the Roman market that hungered for all this collapsed into its own crisis, the coinage debased, the roads unsafe, the appetite for ivory and incense withered, the caravans thinned, the customs posts idled, and the kingdom whose greatest asset was its address discovered the flaw in that asset. An address is only valuable while somebody wants to visit. One engineering achievement of Meroë deserves the fire's attention before we leave the living city, because it is the invisible foundation under everything else, the Hafur. Understand the problem first. Egypt's agriculture is simple in principle. The Nile floods every summer, the water retreats, you sow in the mud. But Meroë sat far south, in the belt where the summer monsoon reaches. A land of seasonal rains, savanna grasses, and vast herds. And its wealth lay as much in cattle and rain-fed sorghum out in the steppe as in the narrow riverside strip. And rain, unlike the Nile, does not stay. It falls in a few tremendous weeks, runs off in flash torrents down the wadis, and vanishes into the sand, leaving 9 months of dry. To keep herds and villages alive out there, away from the river, you must catch the rain and hold it. So they built Hafurs, enormous artificial reservoirs, dug out of the plain and banked with the excavated earth into a great ring. sited to catch the seasonal runoff. Some of them several hundred meters across and many meters deep, capable of holding water for months into the dry season. Dozens have been mapped. The great one at Musawarat Sufra is a landmark still, and the Kushites decorated them, which tells you what they thought of them. The banks of the finest heifers were set with sculpted stone lions and, charmingly, with statues of frogs and other water creatures and reliefs of cattle. The reservoir was not merely infrastructure, but a sacred civic work, guarded by Apodemac's lions, its water blessed. A hafir turned a stretch of dry steppe into a pastoral economy for half the year. It let the herds range far from the Nile and come home to drink. It supported the temple towns like Naka and Musawarat that stand today in what looks, to a visitor, like uninhabitable desert. The kingdom's whole southward orientation, its ability to be an African savanna power rather than a mere Nile thread state, rests on these unglamorous rings of earth, and they are still being built. The hafir is a living technology in Sudan. The modern state has dug hundreds of them, on the same principle, sometimes on the same ground, and rural communities depend on them today exactly as Meroitic herders did 2,000 years ago. Of all the continuities in this story, the sakya, the sorghum beer, the mud brick vault, the Nubian bow, the hafir may be the most quietly eloquent. The greatest empire in the history of Africa outside Egypt worked out how to hold the rain in a dry country, decorated the result with lions, and handed the design to the future, which is still using it. That is what a civilization leaves when the palaces have fallen and the script has locked itself away. Not the boasts, but the water. The end of Meroë is one of the genuine mysteries of African archaeology, and the honest answer is that we do not know how it happened. Only that, across the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the kingdom faded out, and that the fading has more than one plausible cause. Let us lay them out fairly, as the evidence gives them. The first suspect is the economy, and specifically the road north. Meroë's prosperity had rested for centuries on trade with the Mediterranean world through Egypt. Ivory, ebony, gold, incense, animals, enslaved people, moving down the Nile into Roman markets. In the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire fell into its great crisis: currency, collapse, civil war, plague, insecurity. Demand for luxuries dried up, the Nile trade contracted, and the Roman frontier itself receded. The Emperor Diocletian, around AD 298, formally withdrew Rome's border north to the First Cataract, abandoning the buffer province and paying subsidies to desert tribes to keep the peace. Kush's biggest customer had gone into recession and then gone home. A trading state whose market disappears is a state in trouble, and the archaeology of late Meroë. Fewer imports, poorer burials, smaller pyramids, cruder work. Reads exactly like a slow economic strangulation. The second suspect is the land itself. The furnaces of the Iron City burned charcoal for centuries, and charcoal comes from trees. The herds grew. The rains, on the evidence of the environmental record, may have weakened, and the region around Meroë is thought by many specialists to have suffered deforestation, overgrazing, and soil exhaustion. The classic self-inflicted wound of a successful pre-industrial economy that outgrows its ecological base. It is not proven, and some scholars push back, but the picture of a great industrial city gradually eating the woodland that fed it is hard to dismiss when you stand beside the slag mounds and look out at a landscape that is, today, desert. The third suspect came with spears, the desert peoples. From the 4th century, the sources and the archaeology show the pressure of nomadic groups, the Blemirs of the eastern desert and the Nubia of the west, raiding and settling the Kushite lands, taking territory, disrupting the roads, and finally, it appears, occupying much of the kingdom's countryside. The Meroitic state, weakened, could no longer hold its own frontiers. And the fourth is the coup de grace, and it is a famous one. Around AD 350, King Ezana of Aksum, the rising Christian empire of the Ethiopian highlands, which had by then taken over the Red Sea trade that once flowed through Kush, marched down into the Nile Valley and inscribed a triumphal stele recording that he had defeated the Nubia and taken the city of Meroë, and his inscription describes destruction and captives. For a long time, Ezana was cast as the destroyer of Kush. Modern scholarship is more cautious and probably more accurate. Ezana's campaign seems to have arrived at a Meroë that was already dying. A wounded, shrunken, perhaps already partly abandoned city. He did not kill the kingdom so much as certify its death. Put the four suspects together, and you get, once again, the pattern this fire has found in almost every collapse it has told. No single blow, but a conjunction. The market failing, the land tiring, the frontier crumbling, and finally an outside power arriving to take what was left. The kings stopped being buried in pyramids, the script stopped being carved, the great temples fell silent, and the city on the Nile, which had traded with India and defeated Augustus Caesar, quietly emptied. In the villages, life went on, as it always does, and as it did in the Indus Valley and in Assyria. The farmers, the herders, the potters, the smiths carried on being what they had been. The state above them simply evaporated. And out of that world, in one of the most surprising sequels in all of African history, there rose, within 2 centuries, 3 new kingdoms on the same river, speaking the daughter languages of the same people, which would become Christian, would flourish for another 1,000 years, and would stop the armies of Islam at the very gates of Nubia. Kush was dead. Nubia had not even started. Between the emptying of Meroë and the rise of the Christian kingdoms lies a period of 2 centuries that used to be dismissed in a sentence as a dark age, and that turns out, as dark ages usually do when someone finally digs them, to be nothing of the sort. The archaeology of the 4th to 6th centuries AD in Nubia shows not collapse into savagery, but a genuine transformation. The great state dissolved, and in its place rose a landscape of powerful local chiefdoms, prosperous, warlike, and this is the fascinating part. Visibly returning to older, deeper Nubian traditions that the Egyptianized state had overlaid for 1,000 years. The kings of this age were buried not in pyramids, but under tumuli, the great pebble mounds of Kerma, back again after 2,000 years, as if the Egyptian veneer had simply worn through to the African rock beneath. And their graves, excavated at Balana and Kustal in Lower Nubia in the 1930s, in a desperate race against the rising water of the first Aswan Dam, produced treasure that stunned the excavators and remains among the great finds of African archaeology. Silver crowns, heavy, elaborate diadems set with carnelian and glass, mounted with the ram's head of Amun and the sacred cobra, worn by kings who no longer built pyramids but still crowned themselves with the emblems of Kush, silver horse trappings of extraordinary richness, bronze lamps and vessels, weapons, jewelry, and, in the old and terrible manner, sacrificed horses, camels, and human retainers laid around their lords, the retainer burial of Kerma returning after 2 millennia in a country that had, in between, become one of the most sophisticated states in Africa. Historians and archaeologists still argue about who these people were. Nubian successors of the Meroitic elite? The Noba of the inscriptions? The Blemies? Some mixture, as is usually the case, and the argument matters less than what the crowns say, that when the Meroitic state failed, Nubia did not become poor or leaderless or forgetful. It became, for a couple of centuries, itself in an older key, mound building, horse burying, silver crowned, and fiercely independent. And then, presented with a new religion by an empress's intrigue, it built out of that inheritance 3 of the most durable kingdoms of the medieval world, which is why the fire insists on the point once more, at the risk of repetition, because the histories so often get it backwards. The fall of Meroë was not the end of Nubian civilization. It was a hinge. On one side, 3,000 years of Kush, Kerma, Napata, Meroë. On the other, 1,000 years of Christian Nubia. Nobadia, Makuria, Alodia, with painted cathedrals, a literature in Old Nubian, an army that stopped the caliphate, and a treaty that outlasted the Crusades. 4,000 years, 1 river, 1 people, 3 religions, and never, not once in all that time, save for the new kingdom's occupation. successfully conquered from outside. Set that record beside any state in the history of the world and see how many can match it. Most tellings of Kush stop at Meroë's fall, and it is a mistake, because what happened next is one of the most remarkable and least known stories in the history of Africa. And it is, in the deepest sense, the same story continuing under new gods. Out of the post-Meroitic centuries, a fascinating, half-lit age of tumulus-building chiefs whose royal graves at Balana and Kustal, excavated on the eve of the Aswan flooding, produced silver crowns encrusted with carnelian, horse trappings, and the sacrificed retainers of an older Nubia reasserting itself. They're consolidated, by the 6th century, 3 new kingdoms along the river. Nobadia in the north, Makuria in the middle, and Alodia in the south, around modern Khartoum. And in the 540s there arrived, from the Christian Roman world, the missionaries. And here the story acquires a wonderful piece of imperial comedy, preserved by a contemporary church historian. The Emperor Justinian and his Empress Theodora, who belonged to rival factions of the great theological quarrel of the age, each dispatched a mission to convert Nubia to their own version of Christianity. And Theodora, playing the palace game with a ruthlessness Justinian evidently underestimated, sent orders ahead to delay her husband's envoys. Her missionary arrived first, and Nubia became, and remained for 1,000 years, Miaphysite Christian, the faith of the Coptic and Ethiopian churches. An empress's intrigue in Constantinople decided the religion of the Upper Nile for a millennium, and Christian Nubia flourished, genuinely, richly, and with a self-confidence that startles anyone who meets it for the first time. Churches went up by the hundreds, from great cathedrals to village chapels, and their walls were painted. And the paintings survive. The murals rescued from the Cathedral of Pharaohs before the Aswan waters took it are among the treasures of medieval art anywhere in the world, and they hang today in Warsaw and Khartoum, monumental figures in glowing ochre and blue and rose, bishops with their names inscribed beside them, saints, the Virgin, warrior archangels, and, standing among them in full royal regalia, the kings and the queen mothers of Nubia, black African monarchs painted with a serene, formal grandeur that owes something to Byzantium and everything to Nubia. There is a famous mural of the 3 youths in the fiery furnace protected by an archangel, and another of a Nubian queen under the Virgin's protecting hand, and they will stop you in the gallery. The kingdoms were literate in 3 languages at once: Greek for the liturgy, Coptic for the church, and Old Nubian, the native tongue, written in a Greek-derived alphabet with a few signs borrowed from the old Meroitic script, the writing of Kush, its last children, carrying on into Christian scripture. And here, the fire notes it with pleasure. The descendants of the Meroites finally speak to us in a language we can read. The old Nubian documents are letters, deeds, and prayers, and they give us the voices that Meroitic denies us, the same river, the same people, at last audible. And then came the great test, and Nubia passed it in a way nobody expected. In AD 641, the armies of the new Islamic Caliphate took Egypt with astonishing speed, a conquest that had, in a decade, swallowed Persia and the Levant, and pushed south to do the same to Nubia. They ran into the archers, the Nubian bowmen, the same Tasseti tradition, 3,000 years old, met the Arab armies at Dongola in 642 and again, decisively, in 652. And the Arab chroniclers, who did not enjoy writing about defeats, record the encounter with a kind of appalled respect. The Nubians shot at the eyes, they wrote, with such precision that the Arab soldiers came away blinded, and the Muslims called them the pupil smiters, the archers who aimed for the eye. The invasion stalled, and rather than continue a war it could not cheaply win, the Caliphate did something it did almost nowhere else in its entire expansion. It made a treaty. The Pact, signed in 652, was a unique agreement of non-aggression and regulated trade between the Islamic State and Christian Nubia, exchanging annual gifts, the terms, and the ugly fact that captives were among them are part of the honest record, fixing the frontier and guaranteeing the peace. And it held. Not for a generation, for 600 years. While Islam swept across North Africa to the Atlantic and into Spain, Christian Nubia sat on the Nile, unconquered, trading, painting its cathedrals, and writing its documents. The longest-standing frontier treaty in the medieval world, kept by a kingdom of archers whose ancestors had been shooting at the eyes since before the pyramids of Giza were built. Nubia's Christian centuries ran, in the end, out of time rather than out of courage. The treaty eroded in the 13th and 14th centuries under Mamluk pressure from Egypt. Arab nomadic migration into the Nile Valley steadily changed the population, the language, and the faith. The kingdoms fragmented, and by around 1500 the last of them, Alodia, had fallen, and Nubia was Muslim and Arabic-speaking, as, overwhelmingly, it is today. But the sum should be spoken clearly, because it is one of the great long durations in world history. From the first kings of Kerma around 2500 BC to the fall of Christian Alodia around AD 1500, 4,000 years of continuous, self-governing, literate, monumental civilization on the Middle Nile. Kush and its heirs outlasted pharaonic Egypt, the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, Alexander's world, Rome, and Byzantium. And in all that time it was conquered from outside exactly once, briefly, by New Kingdom Egypt. And never again, not by Assyria, not by Persia, whose invasion, Herodotus says, died in the desert, not by Alexander, who never tried, not by Rome, which tried and settled, not by the Caliphate, which tried and signed. Whatever else the world may say about the kingdoms of the Upper Nile, they were, on the evidence of 4 millennia, among the hardest places on earth to take. Return, before the end, to the wound at the centre of this whole night, the script we cannot read, because the story of Meroëtic is one of the great unfinished detective stories of scholarship, and its solving, when it comes, will rewrite everything we said tonight. Here is what we have. Around the 2nd century BC, Kush stopped writing in Egyptian and began writing its own language in a script of its own devising. 23 signs in 2 forms. A monumental hieroglyphic version for temple and pyramid walls, and a flowing cursive for everyday use on ostraca, papyri, and stelae. The signs are borrowed shapes, Egyptian in origin, but the system is not Egyptian at all. It is an alphabet, or more precisely an alphasyllabary, with signs for consonants and a handful of vowels. Vastly simpler and more efficient than the hieroglyphic monster it replaced. And it is punctuated by a small triple-dot word divider that no Egyptian scribe ever used, a courtesy to the reader that, ironically, is the very reason modern scholars can be so confident about where Meroëtic words begin and end without knowing what any of them mean. And here is the breakthrough that both saved and taunted us. In 1909, the British Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith cracked the phonetics, using the one lever available, royal names. Kushite kings and queens appear in both Egyptian and Meroëtic inscriptions, match the names across the 2 scripts, and the sound values of the Meroëtic signs fall out one by one. Within a few years, Griffith could read Meroëtic aloud with confidence, and understood nothing. Because knowing the sounds of a language tells you nothing about its meaning unless you know the language, and Meroëtic is related to no language that anyone can securely identify. The leading hypothesis places it in the Eastern Sudanic branch of the Nilo-Saharan family, a cousin, that is, of the Nubian languages still spoken along the same river today. The case has grown steadily stronger over the last few decades, and a small vocabulary has been extracted by patient contextual work. We know the words for mother and father, for great one and king, a scattering of titles, some kinship terms, funerary formulae repeated on hundreds of chapel stellae, blessed one. May you drink water? May you eat bread? The phrases repeat so predictably that their sense is inferable even where their grammar is not. But the sentences will not open. Read a Meroëtic inscription today and you are exactly where Griffith was, sounding out, fluently, a message you cannot understand. What would break it is what has always broken these things, a bilingual, a text of real length in Meroëtic and in a language we know. The Rosetta Stone did it for Egyptian, Behistun did it for cuneiform, and somewhere in the sand of Sudan, on the overwhelming odds of history, such a text exists. An official decree, a treaty, a temple dedication issued in Meroëtic and Greek, or Meroitic and Egyptian, by a kingdom that traded with Rome and Alexandria and India for 600 years. 90% of Kush's archaeology is undug. The great cities have barely been touched. The field is desperately under-resourced and, at the moment of this telling, working through a war. But the stone is there. And on the day it is turned over, 200 pyramids will begin to speak. The queens will tell us their prayers. The kings will explain their wars. And the whole silent, brilliant, lion-hearted second half of this civilization will step out of the dark and speak for itself. And everything we have said tonight, assembled painstakingly from enemy annals and mute stone, will be corrected by the only people entitled to correct it. That is the standing hope of Nubian studies, and it is not romantic, it is realistic. Every other script in this position has fallen. This one is simply waiting its turn. Now the modern chapters, which are as dramatic as anything in the ancient ones, and rather more painful. Begin with the villain, because he is unforgettable. In 1834, there arrived at Meroë an Italian physician and adventurer named Giuseppe Fellini, who had come to Sudan in the service of the Egyptian army and had conceived the belief, correct as it turned out, that the pyramids of Meroë held treasure. His method was not archaeology. Fellini hired labourers and, working through the royal cemetery, simply demolished the pyramids from the top down, dismantling them or blasting them course by course in search of hidden chambers. He wrecked more than 40 of them. And in the pyramid of Queen Amenhotep, a ruling Candace of the 1st century BC, he struck it, a chamber near the summit, and inside it a hoard of royal jewellery of breathtaking quality, gold armlets and signet rings and shield rings and necklaces, one of the greatest treasures ever found in Africa. He carried it to Europe, where, in the finest irony of the affair, nobody would believe him. European experts refused to accept that such sophisticated goldwork could have come from Black Africa, and assumed it was fake or misattributed. Fellini had trouble selling it. Eventually, it was bought, and it is divided today between museums in Munich and Berlin, where it is recognized for exactly what it is: the jewelry of an African queen, torn from her tomb by a treasure hunter who left 40 pyramids in ruins to get it. Look at photographs of Meroë today, and you will see his signature everywhere. The pyramids standing with their tops sheared off, flat and broken, like a field of decapitated monuments. That is Fellini. Restoration has repaired a few. Most still wear their wounds. The second modern chapter is sadder and larger, and it is a story of water. In the 20th century, Egypt built dams at Aswan. First the Low Dam, then, in the 1960s, the colossal High Dam. And the reservoir behind it, Lake Nasser, drowned Lower Nubia entirely. Hundreds of kilometers of the ancient valley, with its temples, its towns, its churches, its cemeteries, and its living villages, went under the water. The world remembers the rescue of Abu Simbel. The great temple of Rameses cut into blocks and lifted to higher ground in one of the most famous engineering feats of the century. And it was magnificent. But the Nubian story is the other half of it. An international salvage campaign raced the rising water through the sites of Nubia. Excavating what it could and saving what it could, the pharaoh's cathedral murals came out in those years, and the Balana crowns, and much else, and everything else. The great majority is at the bottom of the lake. And with it went the people. Some 100,000 Nubians, whose villages and fields and ancestral cemeteries were drowned, were resettled hundreds of kilometers away in Egypt and Sudan, in new towns far from the river that had defined them for 5,000 years. It is one of the largest cultural displacements of the modern age, and the Nubian communities carry the memory of it still. The drowned homeland is the great theme of modern Nubian music, poetry, and identity. And the dam that gave Egypt its electricity took from Nubia its deepest continuity. And the danger has not ended. New dams have been built and proposed on the Sudanese Nile. The Meroë Dam, completed in 2009, flooded another long stretch of the Nile above the Fourth Cataract, drowning archaeological sites and displacing communities in its turn, again with a salvage campaign racing the water. And further proposals remain live. every generation, this valley is asked to trade its past for its power supply. But the last modern chapter is hopeful, and it deserves the fire's attention. The archaeology of Sudan is, today, one of the most exciting fields in the world, and it is transforming what we know at a pace no other ancient civilization can match, because so little of it has been dug. The Sudanese Antiquities Service, working with Sudanese, European, and American teams, is uncovering new sites constantly. The great cemeteries and cities of Kerma, Napata, and Meroë have yielded discovery after discovery in recent decades. Taharqa's flooded tomb, explored by divers, new temples and royal statues found at the Fourth Cataract before the waters rose, whole unsuspected settlements traced by satellite, the Meroitic script attacked by linguists with new corpora and computational tools, and the field's quiet consensus is that decipherment is a matter of finding the right bilingual text, not of impossibility. Meroë, Gebel Barkal, and Kerma are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. A Sudanese generation of archaeologists is telling the story from inside it, and the old colonial framing is dead. And the story continues in the hardest way, too. Sudan's recent years have brought war, and the museums and sites have been in danger. Looting, damage, and the terrible arithmetic of a country in crisis. The National Museum in Khartoum, holding the finest collection of Kushite antiquities on earth, has suffered in the fighting, and the world has watched with dread. The people who guard this heritage, often at great personal cost, are keeping the last physical memory of a 4,000-year civilization in conditions no curator should ever face. It is worth saying their names in silence if you know none of them to say aloud. Before the summing up, an inventory, because the physical remains of this civilization are scattered across the world in a pattern that is itself a piece of history, and knowing where the things are is part of knowing the story. In Sudan, the National Museum in Khartoum holds the greatest collection of Kushite antiquities anywhere. The colossal black granite statues of Taharqa and his line, the Meroitic bronzes, the temple reliefs, and the temples themselves, rescued whole from the flooding of Lower Nubia and rebuilt in the museum garden beside the Nile. It is one of the great museums of Africa and, at the time of this telling, one of the most endangered, having been caught in the fighting of a civil war. A fact that no one who has ever cared about this civilization can contemplate calmly. At Kerma, the museum built beside the Defufa holds the 7 great statues from the pit, standing where they were made. And in the desert, the sites themselves, Meroë's pyramid fields, Gebel Barkal, Naka, Musawarat, Old Dongola, UNESCO listed, magnificent, and almost empty of visitors. In Britain, the British Museum holds the bronze head of Augustus that Amanirenas buried under her doorstep, the Shabaka stone with its rescued theology, sculptures from Kawa and Gebel Barkal, and a great deal excavated in the era when finds were divided with the excavators. In Germany, the jewellery of Queen Amanishakato, dynamited out of her pyramid by Fellini, and now split between Munich and Berlin. In Boston, the enormous Reisner collection from the royal cemeteries, the finest holdings of Napatan and Meroitic material outside Sudan, including the horse burial's silver trappings. In Poland, the Pharaohs cathedral murals, saved from the water by a Polish mission and now the pride of the Warsaw National Museum. A gallery of Nubian bishops and kings and Christ in glory, in a city 8,000 kilometers from the wall where they were painted. And in Cairo, in the Louvre, in Toronto, in a dozen other places, fragments, statues, stelae, beads. The fire records this plainly, without lecturing. Much of it came out in the age of colonial archaeology, under laws and customs that the present age has revised. Some of it was straightforwardly looted Fellini's hoard as theft with a receipt, and some. The Pharaohs' murals, above all, was rescued by foreign teams from certain destruction at their own cost, with the agreement of the authorities of the day. The ethics differ case by case and the arguments are live, and the fire's business is not to adjudicate them tonight, but to note the shape of the thing. A civilization's memory distributed across the museums of the countries that studied it, while the country that built it holds the sites, the sand, the 90% still buried, and, at this hour, a war. If there is a single practical wish this night's story can voice, it is this: that the museums keep their Kushite galleries open and honest and full of visitors, that the excavations resume, that the bilingual is found, and that the queens of Meroë, who spent their lives insisting on being seen, are finally, properly seen. Before the summing up, the fire owes an hour to the gods, because Kushite religion is the clearest window we have into what Kush actually was. A people who took what they wanted from the greatest religious tradition in the ancient world and then, with total confidence, put their own lion at the center of it. Amun came first, and Amun came from Egypt, planted, as we saw, on the pure mountain by pharaohs who meant him as an instrument of colonial control. What the Kushites made of him was something else. The Amun of Kush is ram-headed. The ram was Amun's sacred animal in Egypt too, but in Nubia the ram-headed form dominates almost to the exclusion of the human one, and rams line the processional avenues of the Kushite temples in stone files. The king wears the ram's head amulet at his throat in every royal portrait, a badge as distinctive as the double uraeus. And this Amun did something for Kush that he never did in Egypt. He chose the kings, personally and publicly, through his oracle. The Kushite succession ran through the mother's line and among brothers, but the final word lay with the god. The candidates were brought before the sanctuary at Gebel Barkal and the oracle. The priests, moving the god's bark, giving the sign, selected the king. A stele of the king, a spelter, records the whole procedure in extraordinary detail. The assembled commanders and priests debating, praying, and finally submitting the choice to Amun, who nods toward the man he wants. It is one of the very few royal selection ceremonies from antiquity we can actually watch happening, and it made the priesthood of the Pure Mountain the most powerful institution in Kush. So powerful that the Greek historian Diodorus preserves a story, chilling if true, that the priests of Amun could send a message to the king ordering him to die, and that king's obeyed. Until, in the 3rd century BC, a king named Ergomenes, educated in Greek philosophy, marched his soldiers into the temple, killed the priests, and abolished the custom. The story is late, moralized, and unverifiable. It may be Greek fantasy about the strange south, but it clusters, suggestively, right around the period when the royal burials moved from Napata to Meroë, a shift of political center away from the priestly city, and archaeologists have wondered ever since whether Diodorus, for once, heard something real. Beside Amun stood Isis, and Isis mattered enormously, especially in the north, at Philae, on the border island where Egypt and Nubia met. Her temple there was one of the last functioning pagan temples in the entire Roman world, and it survived so long for a specific reason. The Nubians would not let it close. By treaty with Rome, Nubian pilgrims retained the right to come north and worship Isis at Philae and to carry her statue upriver on festival journeys. When the Christian emperors were closing the temples of the Mediterranean, Philae kept its priests and its rites because the Kushites and their successors insisted. And the very last hieroglyphic inscription ever carved anywhere on earth, dated AD 394, and the last demotic one, from AD 452, were both cut at Philae by priests serving a Nubian clientele. Think of that for a moment, because it is one of the strangest honors in the history of writing. The 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian hieroglyphs, the script of Khufu and Ramesses, draws its final breath in a temple kept alive by Nubians. The people the pharaohs called wretched were the last worshippers left in Egypt's house, and they turned out the lights. And then, at the center of Meroë's own religious life, stands the god who is Kush's alone, Apedemek. He has no Egyptian counterpart. He arrives with the southern kingdom and belongs to it entirely. He is a lion, sometimes wholly a lion, more often a powerful man with a lion's head, carrying a bow, a sceptre, or a bound sheaf of captives, god of war, of kingship, of victory, and, the reliefs suggest, of the fertility of herds and fields, which is exactly the combination a cattle-keeping warrior state would want. His temples at Musawarat Sufra and Naka are the masterpieces of Meroitic architecture, and their reliefs are like nothing else on the Nile. the lion god receiving offerings from the king and the queen, standing at equal scale, elephants processing along the walls, lions crouched at the entrances, the whole visual language declaring, in stone, that any visitor from Egypt could read at a glance that this is not Egypt. And at Naka, on the rear wall of the Lion Temple, Apedemak appears in the form that has puzzled and delighted scholars ever since, with 3 lion heads and 4 arms, distributing grain and offerings to the royal couple. A polycephalic, multi-armed deity, so unexpected in a Nile context that the Indian resonance is impossible not to notice and impossible to prove. The trade roads ran to the Indian Ocean, and ideas travel with cargo, and beyond that, no honest person can say more. What matters is what the image announces about its makers. Kush was a civilization confident enough to invent its own iconography of divinity at the summit of its temple art, in a form its mighty northern neighbour would have found unintelligible, and to put its queens in the picture at the same size as its kings. Take the whole religious portrait together, and you have Kush entire, the imported god made native and made kingmaker. The borrowed goddess kept burning after her own homeland had abandoned her, and, presiding over both, a lion out of Africa with a bow in his hand. Return now to where the night began, the pyramid fields, and look at them properly, because the royal cemeteries of Kush are the single greatest body of evidence for this civilization, and their story spans the whole 1,000 years. Understand first how a Kushite pyramid differs from an Egyptian one, because the differences are the civilization in miniature. They are small. The largest at Meroë is about 30 meters tall, a fraction of Giza's Great Pyramid. These are not mountains but monuments. They are steep, angles of 60 to 70 degrees against Giza's 51, giving them their distinctive needle-like, flame-like silhouette against the sky and their crowded, sharp-edged skyline. They are late. The Kushites were building pyramids for 1,000 years after Egypt had stopped, so that the great majority of the pyramids in the world, perhaps 250 in Sudan against Egypt's 100-odd, are Kushite. Their burial chamber is not inside the pyramid at all, but cut into the bedrock beneath it, reached by a stairway from the east. The pyramid is a marker over a rock-cut tomb, not a container. And each has, attached to its eastern face, a chapel, a small offering room where the priests served the dead monarch, its walls carved with the reliefs that give us so much of what we know. The king or queen enthroned, the funeral procession, the judgment scene borrowed from Egypt but populated with Kushite figures, the goods and cattle of the offering, and Apedemak and Ammon receiving the dead. Then walk the cemeteries in sequence, and you walk the whole history. El Kuru, oldest of them, the ancestral graveyard of the Napatan house, where the mounds of the early chiefs evolve, generation by generation, into the pyramids of Piye and his family, and where the excavators found, in their own pits, the buried chariot teams. 24 horses, standing upright in harness with silver-plated trappings and bead nets, sacrificed and interred beside their kings. The horse-loving dynasty of the Hermopolis stables, taking their teams with them. Nuri, across the river from the Holy Mountain, where Taharqa built his great pyramid, and where 20 kings and 50-odd queens of the Napatan line lie. The tombs cut deep, and the water table has risen through the centuries so that the greatest of them, Taharqa's own, must now be explored by archaeologists in diving gear, swimming down a flooded stair by lamplight into a chamber where the gilded shabtis stand in ranks under the water. One of the most extraordinary excavation scenes anywhere in the world. And Meroë, the last and greatest, 3 cemeteries on the desert ridge. The south and north royal fields, and the great commoner's ground, where 40-odd kings and queens sleep under some 200 pyramids, and where the story of the kingdom's rise and fading can be read in the stone itself. The confident, well-built monuments of the Great Age, the fine chapel reliefs, the imported Roman glass, and the Kushite gold in the burial chambers. And then, in the late pyramids, the shrinking scale, the cruder masonry, the poorer goods, a civilization's decline recorded in its own tombstones. And through all of it, the 2 constants that make the Kushite cemeteries unlike any other in the ancient world. The queens are there in force, under pyramids of their own, with their own chapels and their own inscriptions. Amenishakheto, Amanirenas, Amanitor, and their sisters, buried as monarchs, not as consorts. And the inscriptions on the later chapels are in Meroitic, so that we stand in the offering chapel of a queen who fought Rome and can sound out her name, her titles, and her prayers, and not understand a single sentence of what her people wished for her in the afterlife. It is the most poignant place in this entire story. 200 pyramids in the sand, 400 royal dead, 1,000 years of a civilization's greatest ambitions. And the labels are all in a language we cannot read. The kings and queens have had the night. Give the fire an hour now for the 9 in 10. The farmers, herders, potters, and smiths whose lives were the actual substance of 4,000 years, and whom the archaeology, working patiently through the towns and village cemeteries, lets us meet. Begin with the food, because the Kushite table tells you at once that this is Africa and not Egypt. Egypt lived on wheat and barley. Winter crops, sown on the Nile flood's retreat. Kush, especially in the south, lived on sorghum and millet. African grains, summer crops, sown to the monsoon rains that reach the Meroitic belt and never reach Egypt at all. And this single agricultural fact is the deepest reason Meroë could exist where it did, and why the kingdom's centre of gravity slid south. The grain was ground, baked into flat breads and thick porridges, and, crucially, brewed sorghum beer, the great drink of the Nilotic and Sudanic world, thick and nourishing, made in the household, and consumed at every level of society, exactly as it is in the villages of Sudan today. Around the grain, cattle, the wealth and the obsession. The herds that had been the pride of Kerma were still the pride of Meroë 2,000 years later, providing milk, blood, meat on feast days, hides, dung for fuel, and above all status, goats and sheep in the drier margins, fish from the Nile, dates and dom palm fruit, melons and pulses in the irrigated plots. And, from the 4th century BC onward, the technology that changed everything. The Sakya, the ox-driven water wheel, which allowed year-round irrigation of land above the floodline and quietly expanded the cultivable Nile by a margin no army ever achieved. The houses were mud brick, flat-roofed, courtyard-centered. Cool, sensible, and virtually identical to the houses of Nubian villages photographed in the 20th century before the flooding. Families slept on the roofs in summer, as they still do. The people themselves, visible in their art, their skeletons, and the accounts of every visitor, were dark-skinned Africans, tall and often strikingly so. The Greeks, meeting them, called them Aethiopes, burnt-faced, and Herodotus is emphatic, thought them the tallest and handsomest of men, and their kings chosen for size and strength. They wore linen and, increasingly, cotton. Meroë wove cotton on a serious scale, centuries before it was common in the Mediterranean, draped as kilts, robes, and shawls. The elite wore ram's head amulets, heavy gold armlets, earrings of extraordinary craft. The queens, on the reliefs, wear fringed and tasselled robes of magnificent complexity, layered and voluminous, with elaborate jewellery. A court fashion with no Egyptian parallel at all, entirely Kushite and unmistakable. And they wore, some of them, tattoos and scarification patterns that the mummies and figurines preserve. And body ornament of every kind was pervasive across all classes. The graves of ordinary Kushites, like those of ordinary Nubians for 5,000 years before them, are full of beads. They worked hard and skillfully. The potters, whose eggshell-thin painted wares are among the finest ceramics of the ancient world, decorated with giraffes and crocodiles and vines and cheerful little frogs. The weavers, the ironworkers of Meroë with their bloomeries and slag heaps. The goldsmiths whose work Fellini would later dynamite his way to. The boatmen who knew every rock of 6 cataracts. The caravaneers who crossed the Bayuda Desert on the great shortcut from Meroë to Napata, a route still walked by camel today. Their medicine, on the bones' evidence, was tough and practical. Their lives were shorter than ours and physically hard, as everywhere in the ancient world. And their society, if the graves speak true, was less spectacularly unequal than Egypt's. Rich burials, yes, and royal ones, but a broad middling class of decent, provisioned tombs. And they had one more distinction. They were, for the entire span of this story, the most feared archers on earth. Every Kushite village raised boys to the bow, and the state that grew from those villages fought off, in turn, the Persians, the Romans, and the armies of the caliphate. The land of the bow was not a metaphor. It was a demographic fact, and it was why Kush lasted 4,000 years. Follow the money, because Kush's whole political history, the wars with Egypt, the Egyptian occupation, the rise of Napata, the pivot to Meroë, is the history of a single question: who controls the gold and the roads? The gold first. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea is a geologist's treasure house and its richest ancient workings. The Wadi al-Laki, above all, lay squarely in Nubian territory. The Egyptians industrialized the extraction on a scale that still impresses. Hundreds of mining settlements have been mapped in the desert, with grinding stones, washing tables, water cisterns and wells sunk along the routes. The ore was crushed by hand, ground to powder, and washed on sloping tables to separate the gold. Brutal, thirsty labor performed largely by conscripts, prisoners, and the enslaved, and a Greek writer's later description of the mines of Nubia, quoted by Diodorus, is one of the grimmest passages to survive from antiquity. Men and women and children working in chains underground, driven with whips, without hope of relief. The fire records it plainly, because the gold of the pharaohs, the gold of Tutankhamun's mask, came out of this ground, and it came out on the backs of people whose names no one wrote down. What made the mines work was water, the wells and cisterns along the desert roads, and the great engineering effort of the Egyptian state to sink them. And when Egypt withdrew, the mines and the wells passed to Kush, which is precisely why the kingdom of Napata was rich enough, within 2 centuries, to conquer Egypt. Then the roads. The Nile is a highway with 6 locks, the cataracts, and so the real transport network of Kush was amphibious, riverboats between the cataracts and camel and donkey caravans across the desert to bypass them and to cut the great bends. The most important of these was the Bayuda Road, the desert shortcut across the inside of the Great Bend, from Meroë to Napata, saving hundreds of kilometers of river, and the Korosko Road in the north, cutting the bend below the Second Cataract, which was the main artery between Egypt and Nubia for millennia and is still visible as a track. East, to the Red Sea, ran the roads to the ports, first Egyptian and Ptolemaic, later Roman, through which Kush touched the ocean trade, and south and west, into Kordofan and beyond, ran the routes to the interior, whose goods, ivory, ebony, gold, animals, and captives, were Kush's stock in trade. The camel, arriving in these regions in the last centuries BC, transformed the desert roads and, incidentally, gave the kingdom's enemies new mobility too. And what moved along them all is the answer to how a kingdom in the middle of the Sahara could afford pyramids and iron. Kush was a middleman, the toll-keeper on the only road connecting the wealth of inner Africa to the markets of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Egypt wanted ivory, the Mediterranean wanted gold, Rome wanted elephants and exotica, India traded through the Red Sea, and everything, for 3,000 years, had to come through the Middle Nile. Kush's greatest asset was not its mines or its herds, it was its address. Draw the night together now, as the embers settle. The deep themes this forgotten empire has been teaching beneath its pyramids. The first, history is written by the neighbors, and the neighbors lie. For 3,000 years, Kush was described almost entirely by Egypt, and Egypt described it as wretched, servile, and barbarous. A description that Europe, arriving with its own prejudices, was delighted to inherit and reluctant to test. And beneath that description stood cities, iron, gold, queens, temples, pyramids, and an empire that conquered Egypt and defeated Rome. Whenever a people is known to you only through the words of those who fought them or ruled them, assume you know nothing. The archive is a courtroom in which only one side has been called. The second, the tools of empire cannot be lent safely. Egypt colonized Nubia and, to hold it, taught Nubia its gods, its script, its ideology of divine kingship, and planted Amun on a Nubian mountain. 4 centuries later, a Nubian king marched north claiming that same god's mandate and took the throne of Egypt with Egypt's own theology in his hand. Whatever a conqueror teaches, it teaches to the conquered's grandchildren, and no lesson taught under duress stays where you put it. The third, what the center calls the periphery is only the center of somewhere else. From Memphis, Nubia was the far edge of the world. From Meroë, Egypt was the far edge of Africa. And the roads that mattered ran south into the savanna and east to the ocean, where the goods of India came ashore. Kush is history's standing reminder that every map has a center, and the center is wherever the mapmaker is standing. Move the map, and the empire you dismissed becomes the crossroads of a continent. The fourth, endurance is the rarest kind of strength. Egypt is famous, and Egypt fell, to Assyria, to Persia, to Greece, to Rome, and stayed fallen. Kush and its heirs held the Middle Nile for 4,000 years, conquered from outside exactly once, and stopped in turn the Persians, the Romans, and the armies of the Caliphate. They achieved it not by being the strongest state in the world, but by being an unprofitable place to invade. Hard country, hard people, and archers who aimed at the eyes. And by knowing, when they had to, when to walk home from a conquered throne. There is a kind of power that consists of being impossible to be bothered with, and it outlasts glory. And the fifth, the quietest, the silence is not emptiness. Meroitic is unread. The Kushite voice is muffled. The story we told tonight is assembled from stones, tombs, enemy annals, and one great stele about a king who loved his horses. And yet what came through the silence is unmistakably a civilization with its own mind, its lion god, its queens, its iron, its aesthetics, its refusals. When a people cannot speak to you, listen harder to what they made. The pyramids in the sand are a sentence, even if we cannot yet read it. And one day, on the evidence of every other script that has fallen, someone will. The state died. But this fire has learned to ask a better question than when did it fall? Namely, what went on living? And for Kush, the answer runs surprisingly deep, and it runs, as usual, through the hands of ordinary people rather than the annals of kings. The people themselves, first and most obviously, the Nubians of today, some millions of them in Sudan and southern Egypt, are the direct descendants of the population of Kush, and they know it. Their languages, the Nubian tongues, are the living cousins and, most linguists now think, the descendants of relatives of the Meroitic that we cannot read. Their villages stood on the same riverbank, their houses followed the same courtyard plan, their fields grew the same sorghum. Nubian identity survived Christianity, survived Islam, survived Arabic, and survives today as a fierce and articulate cultural nationalism, expressed in music, in poetry, in the great modern lament for the drowned homeland, and in a scholarly reclamation of the Kushite past that has, in the last 50 years, done more to restore this civilization's reputation than a century of foreign excavation. The customs, second. And here the continuities are startling to anyone who looks. The Sakya water wheel, arriving in Kushite times, is still turning on this river. The Hafir Reservoir, the great circular rain catchment of Meroë, is still built in Sudan under the same principle and often on the same sites. The modern Sudanese state has dug new ones. Nubian mud-brick vaulting, developed here, is a documented influence on modern architecture. The Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi famously rediscovered and championed the Nubian vault as a technology for building beautiful houses without timber or steel. And the technique he revived was learned from Nubian masons whose fathers had learned it from theirs. Ritual archery, cattle wealth culture, riverine boat design, the ubiquity of body ornament. The ethnographers keep finding the old bones under the new skin. And the story itself. This is the survival that has mattered most in our own century. For 100 years, Kush was the missing chapter, taught, if at all, as an Egyptian footnote. Then, from the mid-20th century, it was reclaimed by Sudanese and Nubian scholars, by the great rescue campaigns that forced the world to look at what the dams were drowning, by African and diaspora historians for whom the black pharaohs and the warrior queens were not a curiosity but a correction, and by a rising generation of archaeologists who dug and kept finding that everything the old textbooks said was too small. Today, Kush is where it belongs. In the front rank of the ancient civilizations, an African empire on its own terms, and one of the longest-lived states the human species has ever produced. That reclamation is itself part of the story, the last chapter, and the one still being written, and the one in which, for the first time in 3,000 years, the description of Kush is being composed by people who are not its enemies. Piye and Amanirenas would have understood the significance of that better than anyone. They spent their lives insisting, against a very loud consensus, on who they actually were. So let the whole of it flow past once more, gathered and slow, the way the Nile flows past the pyramids at Meroë. The entire story, once through, from the black earth to the drowned villages and out the other side. It begins with a river that runs the wrong way through a hard country. 6 cataracts, 2 deserts, a thread of green. And, buried in the rock beside it, the gold that the ancient world could not do without, and, living along it, the archers the ancient world could not defeat. At Kerma, 4,500 years ago, Africa's first great city kingdom rises, the huge mud-brick Defufa standing over the plain. Kings buried under pebble mounds 90 meters across, on beds of ebony and ivory, with 4,000 cattle skulls laid in crescents around them and the finest pottery of the ancient Nile in their hands. A state rich enough to ally with Egypt's enemies and raid Egypt's temples. Until Egypt, at the height of its new kingdom fury, comes south, burns the city, and annexes the whole river for 500 years. And in those 5 colonial centuries, Egypt does the thing that will undo it. It plants its greatest god on a Nubian mountain, and teaches the Nubians that Amun of the Pure Mountain chooses kings. Egypt withdraws, 3 dark centuries pass, and out of them rises Napata, a kingdom with Egypt's script, Egypt's gods, Egypt's pyramids, and Nubia's mother line, Nubia's brother's succession, Nubia's gold, and Nubia's bows. In 727 BC, its king, Piye, marches north to save Amun's temples from impious princes, conquers all of Egypt, rebukes a defeated prince chiefly for starving his horses, installs his sister as God's wife of Amun, and goes home to his mountain and never returns. His dynasty, the 25th, rules the whole Nile for a century and restores it. Temples rebuilt, arts revived, pyramids raised again after 800 years, and the oldest theology in Egypt copied onto black granite by a Kushite king so it will not be lost. Then Taharqa, greatest of them and named in the Bible, meets Assyria, and the storm takes Egypt away. The crown prince marched to Nineveh in chains, Thebes sacked. The black pharaohs falling back beyond the cataracts in 663 BC. And there, in the deep south, out of reach, Kush does the most interesting thing in its history. It stops looking north. The court moves to Meroë in the rain belt, among the iron ore and the acacia. The kingdom turns its face to Africa and the Indian Ocean. It starts writing its own language in its own alphabet, which we still cannot read. It puts a lion god with 4 arms at the center of its temples. It grows sorghum, smelts iron by the mountain of slag, digs vast reservoirs for the herds, trades ivory to Rome, and buys glass from Alexandria and beads from India. And it is ruled again and again by queens in their own right, the Candaces, who appear on temple walls at the same size as kings, raising the same sword. And when Augustus Caesar's Rome comes up the river to swallow it, one of those queens, Amanirenas, one-eyed and unbroken, fights the legions for 5 years, forces the emperor to a treaty that remits all tribute, and buries the bronze head of Caesar's own statue under a temple step for her people to walk on. 6 centuries of prosperity follow, and then the market fails, and the woods thin, and the desert peoples press in, and Axum arrives to certify a death already underway, and Meroë quietly empties around AD 350. But the river does not empty. 3 Christian kingdoms rise on the same ground, paint cathedrals whose murals now hang in Warsaw, write Old Nubian in Greek letters. And, in 652, meet the armies of the Caliphate with the same bows their ancestors carried at Kerma, shoot the invaders in the eyes, and win from Islam a treaty of peace that holds for 600 years. The last hieroglyphs ever carved anywhere on earth are cut by priests serving Nubian pilgrims at Philae in AD 394. The kingdoms fade at last around 1500, 4,000 years after Kerma. Then the treasure hunter comes with his dynamite and beheads 40 pyramids for a queen's gold that Europe refuses to believe an African could have made. And then the dams come and lower Nubia. Its temples, its churches, its cemeteries, its villages, and 100,000 living Nubians' homes goes under the lake. And still, this morning, the pyramids stand on the ridge above Meroë in the rising sun, mostly unexcavated, mostly unvisited, keeping their inscriptions in a script whose sounds we know and whose meaning we do not. The greatest empire Africa ever built outside Egypt, waiting patiently under a sky it has watched for 4,000 years for the world to learn its name. And now the story is told, and there is nothing left to prove and nothing left to defend. The armies are dust, and the caravans have long since passed. The furnaces are cold. The queens are sleeping under their steep small pyramids with their gold and their lion god. And the desert has come back, as it always does, and laid its quiet over everything. Let it all rest now. Let them rest. And let yourself rest with the resting sand. Feel how quiet it has become. We are back where the night began, on the ridge at Meroë, among the pyramids. But the dawn we imagined has turned all the way around into night, and the world is simple again. The great dark shapes of the tombs against the stars, the dunes cooling and ticking softly as the day's heat leaves them, and, away to the west, the Nile. The same Nile, still moving, still patient, still going north as it has gone north through every empire in this story and every empire before them. You may let your eyes rest now, close them, if they wish to close. There is nothing to decipher tonight. The inscriptions have kept their secret for 2,000 years. They will keep it safely until morning. Let your body grow heavy, the way the sand grows heavy as it drifts against the flank of a pyramid, settling, softening, taking the shape of whatever it rests against, asking nothing, holding everything. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands soften and open. The bow unstrung, the arrow laid down, exactly as the old king ordered his soldiers before they entered the holy city. Unstring the bow, lay down the arrow. Tonight there is no battle to fight, and no god to satisfy, and nothing to prove to anyone at all. And let your breath find the oldest rhythm this river knows, in, like the flood coming north out of Africa. Slow, generous, unhurried, bringing everything the year will need. Out, like the water sliding away toward the sea, taking with it, gently, everything that is finished. In and out. The Nile has breathed this way for 1,000,000 years. You may breathe with it for a while. The images of the night can drift past now like sparks from a herder's fire. You do not need to hold a single one. The black and red beaker, thin as an eggshell, in a king's hand at Kerma. The horses standing in their graves in their silver harness. The starving stallions of Hermopolis, and the conqueror's fury on their behalf. The old theology copied onto black granite so it would not be lost. The queen with the sword raised, the same size as her king. The bronze head of Caesar going into the sand beneath the doorstep. The archers who aimed at the eyes, and the treaty that held 600 years. The lion god with his 4 arms, handing out grain to a king and a queen of equal size. The unstrung bow sent to the great king of Persia with its message about who should stay home. The last hieroglyph in the world, cut at Philae by a priest who did not know he was the last. Let each one come and glow and pass and go down into the sand, where all of them have been keeping perfectly well without us for a very long time. And if sleep is rising in you now, let it rise. It comes the way night comes to this desert, quickly, kindly, and completely. The heat lifting, the colours going soft, the stars arriving in their thousands over a country so quiet you can hear the sand settle. The people who built these pyramids believed the dead went east with the sunrise. That is why every chapel door faces that way, and why the queens lie waiting all night with their faces toward the morning. You may lie the same way tonight, without any of the dying, simply turned toward the morning, letting the dark do its patient work, trusting the east to keep its appointment as it has kept it over this river since before there was a name for any of it. And here is a last thought to take down with you, offered gently as the sand settles. Every civilization this fire has visited believed itself permanent, and every one of them was wrong, and yet not one of them vanished entirely. Something always crossed over, a language, a bowl, a way of catching the rain. Kush thought it would last forever, and it did not. But the water wheels are still turning on that river, and the reservoirs are still holding the rain, and the beer is still brewed from sorghum, and the children are still buried when the worst happens with their small clay animals. And somewhere in a village on the Nile tonight, a woman is speaking a language descended from the one on those unread pyramids. Nothing that was truly lived is ever completely lost. It only changes hands. So rest now, traveller. The pyramids have stood 4,000 nights times 10 and are in no hurry whatever. The Nile is running, the sand is warm, and the story is safe. Safer than it has ever been. In fact, because tonight one more person in the world knows the name of Kush, and knows that the queens were real, and knows that somewhere under the desert there is a language waiting to be read. If, some other evening, you wish to walk through other ages and other deserts, the fire will be lit, and new journeys with it. And if tonight's journey brought you rest, you might, tomorrow, in the daylight, leave a word below to say where in the world you slept. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight there is only the ridge and the dark shapes of the tombs and the enormous African sky. The east will take care of the dawn. It has never once failed in all the mornings over this river. Not for the kings of Kerma, not for the queens of Meroë, not for the last priest at Philae, and not for you. You have nothing to do but breathe and settle and let the sand and the stars hold you until it comes. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.